They didn't enter Victorian hospitals to survive. Most entered to disappear. The beds kept their memories, the walls kept their secrets, and the air carried stories no one dared speak aloud. Every hallway hid something unfinished, something that watched more than it helped. Tonight, you will walk with me into the place where healing was never the goal at all. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone entered a Victorian hospital expecting warmth or comfort, the first few steps would quickly correct that expectation. The place felt more like a holding ground than an institution of healing, as though every corridor had already decided the fate of those who walked it. Patients lay in long rows, bodies thinning under coarse blankets, their eyes heavy with the understanding that this building rarely returned people to the world outside. For many, the hospital was not a place where life began again, but where it slowly ran out. Death rates inside these walls were higher than those for people who remained at home. Families often believed that taking a loved one to a hospital was the responsible choice, but the reality was harsher. Illness deepened in crowded rooms, and medical attention, if it could be called that, did not always mean improvement. Many who arrived with manageable ailments deteriorated rapidly, fading in ways that felt both predictable and unstoppable. The poor had the fewest choices. Charity hospitals, advertised as places offering care, were closer to storage sites for the unwanted. Floors were sticky with old spills, walls darkened by years of moisture, and the air hung heavy with the sour scent of sweat and infection. Beds were pushed so close together that patients could feel the warmth of strangers beside them. Privacy did not exist, and dignity dissolved almost immediately. People came looking for help, but what they found was a system too overwhelmed and too neglected to give them even basic comfort. Medical staff did what they could, but what they could often looked more like chance than skill. Many doctors had limited training learned through observation rather than structured education, and believed confidence was enough to compensate for uncertainty. Nurses, when they were present, were rarely trained at all. Some had come from desperate backgrounds, doing whatever tasks were assigned to them, without understanding why those tasks mattered. The hospital functioned on habit and improvisation, not science. New techniques were attempted directly on living patients, turning treatment into something uncomfortably close to experimentation. Patients sensed this, even if no one said it aloud. They felt the hesitations in the hands that treated them, the uncertainty behind every instruction. The beds creaked under shifting bodies, and the sound of coughing echoed endlessly through the wards. It was impossible to ignore the fear that lingered between breaths. People came hoping for improvement, but watched others around them worsen day after day. In a place where death was routine, it became difficult to believe in recovery. Still, the cycle continued. Families brought their sick to the hospital because there were no alternatives. Doctors continued their work because they were the only ones available. And the hospital itself persisted because society accepted it as the only structure capable of managing the sick poor. The expectation of healing faded under the weight of this resignation. The building felt indifferent, as though it existed only to contain decline rather than reverse it. What made the atmosphere truly unsettling was the quiet acceptance shared by almost everyone inside. No one expected clean rooms or gentle care. No one questioned whether the methods used were effective. The hospital was understood as a place separate from ordinary life, a place where suffering was not only common but expected. People arrived already bracing themselves for disappointment, clinging to thin hope simply because they had nothing else. Some patients lie with eyes half open, listening to the footsteps of staff hurry past them without stopping. Others stared at the ceiling, following the stains as though the patterns might offer some kind of distraction. The lucky few slept through most of their decline, unaware of the worsening conditions around them. The unlucky ones witnessed everything: the cries, the smells, the steady procession of bodies carried out through side doors. Those sights stayed with them, even in fevered dreams. For doctors, the workload was relentless. They moved from bed to bed, touching wounds still warm from the hands they had touched moments earlier. Tools were used repeatedly without proper cleaning. Advice was brief, often vague, and rarely reassuring. The absence of real training did not prevent procedures from being attempted, and patients tolerated these attempts because they believed, sometimes desperately, that doing something was better than doing nothing. And yet, for all the movement and effort, The hospital seemed frozen in one unchanging truth: people entered to die. Recovery stories existed, but they were rare enough to feel like rumors. Most patients left through the back, carried by attendants who had long stopped reacting to the sight. Outside streets carried on as usual, with little acknowledgement of the quiet tragedies happening within the hospital walls. It is difficult to describe the feeling of watching a place meant for healing quietly guide people toward their final hours. The hospital did not shout its failures, it simply absorbed them. Each day blended into the next, each patient slipping deeper into illness, while the world outside remained convinced that hospitals stood for progress. The contrast between the ideal and the reality was sharp enough to unsettle anyone who paused long enough to see it clearly. Somewhere in those halls hope thinned, like the fading breath of the people lying in their beds. The promise of care existed only in name. Inside, the hospital's survival depended less on treatment and more on chance. And chance rarely favored those who needed help most. Mothers, fathers, workers, children, anyone could find themselves here lying still, waiting for a relief that rarely arrived. Their families waited too often, pacing the halls until they understood the truth. The hospital was not a place where someone fought to live. It was a place where someone quietly surrendered. In the end, the building itself seemed aware of its reputation. It held its silence like a secret everyone already knew. A place expected to protect life instead pushed it closer to its end. The weight of that truth lingered in every hallway, hinting at something deeper woven into the hospital's routines. And behind those beds, another reality waited, colder and far more revealing. Hospital beds in Victorian wards rarely offered anything resembling comfort. The sheets were seldom washed, and many patients lay directly on fabrics stained with the remnants of whoever had occupied the bed before them. Blood, pus, and waste dried into the cloth, forming patches that stiffened over time. Anyone settling into such a place felt the unpleasant truth immediately. This was not a bed prepared for healing, but a surface meant simply to contain a body. The lack of clean linens was not a temporary oversight, but an accepted reality. Hospitals operated with limited staff, limited water, and little concern for sanitation. Sheets were changed only when they became unbearably foul, and even then, the decision depended on the mood or availability of whoever happened to be on duty. Some patients lay on the same stained fabric for days, their illnesses worsening against the cool dampness that seeped through the bedding. The smell alone hinted that nothing here favored recovery. Death did not grant a bed rest either. When someone died, staff moved quickly, not out of respect but out of necessity. The body was lifted away, the pillow was straightened, and the blanket was pulled tight again. Sometimes a cloth was shaken to remove loose debris. Rarely was anything washed. Within minutes, a new patient could be lying in the exact spot where another person had drawn their final breath. Only the name changed. The bed, unchanged and indifferent, continued its routine. People noticed this pattern quickly. Patients watched bodies being carried out, followed by a brief moment of adjustment, then the arrival of someone new. That constant turnover created an unspoken understanding. A hospital bed was not a place to overcome illness. It was a place to wait and see how swiftly the illness decided to claim another life. The proximity to previous deaths gave the beds a sense of resignation that even the strongest-willed patients felt. In many wards, the beds looked identical, forming rows that stretched from one end of the room to the other. Patients lay motionless on their stiff mattresses, aware that countless others had shared the same space under similar circumstances. Some clutched the edges of the blankets, as though holding on to something that might still keep them anchored. Others simply stared upward in silence, their thoughts unreadable. There was no softness, no sense of personal space, only the weight of the ward pressing down on everyone inside. For the poorest, these conditions were not surprising. Many came from overcrowded homes with little sanitation, so the transition to the hospital did not feel like a rise in quality. Still, the sight of smudged sheets and the knowledge of previous occupants unsettled more than a few. Even those who had lived in the harshest parts of the city recognized that something was deeply wrong when a place claiming to treat the sick could not offer a clean bed. The smell in the wards grew stronger as the day progressed. Warm air carried the sour notes of illness, mixing bodily waste with the iron scent of dried blood. Flies found their way inside, drawn to the stains left uncovered. Patients brushed them away with weak movements, knowing the effort accomplished little. The insects always returned. Cleanliness was a luxury that did not exist here. Doctors rarely paused to consider the state of the beds. Their focus remained on symptoms, procedures, and hurried decisions. For them, a bed was simply a location to place a patient, while work continued. They stepped over stains without noticing and delivered instructions without acknowledging the discomfort felt by the person lying beneath them. In their view, the environment was unavoidable. The hospital was overwhelmed, underfunded, and overcrowded. Clean sheets could not compete with the constant stream of new patients. Nurses, when present, did what they could, though their efforts were limited by time and exhaustion. Some wiped surfaces with damp cloths, but water mixed with dirt only spread the grime further. Others attempted to adjust blankets or add extra layers to cover the worst spots. But no matter how many times they moved the bedding, the truth remained: the bed was closer to a grave than a place of rest. Patients felt their own fragility while lying there. Each shift of the body, each attempt to find a comfortable position, reminded them how unforgiving the surface beneath them was. Many lay still for long stretches of time, not because rest came easily, but because movement only made the discomfort sharper. The mattress pressed into bones already weakened by illness, and the lack of warmth seeped into their limbs. The bed did not help them heal. It simply held them until they no longer needed it. Visitors entering the ward often froze at the sight. Their loved ones seemed swallowed by the starkness of the environment. The thin blanket did nothing to hide the reality that the bed was not meant for recovery. Some visitors whispered prayers, others remained silent, unable to disguise their despair. They saw what the patients already knew, that lying in such a place made the idea of leaving alive feel increasingly distant. The beds shaped the atmosphere of the entire hospital. They represented the final quiet stage of suffering, where people waited not for improvement, but for the slow inevitability of their condition. The sheets told stories no one wanted to hear, and the stained fabric carried memories of countless endings. In these rooms, the line between living and dying blurred at the edges, leaving patients caught somewhere in between. Namvian in this era was far closer to being prepared for burial than for healing. The beds served as narrow containers for bodies that had nowhere else to go, absorbing illness after illness without ever offering hope in return. They stood there day after day, unchanging, unfeeling, and unmistakably tied to the fate of those who lay upon them. What passed for a place of rest revealed how deeply illness had settled into daily life. The quiet movement of staff around these rigid frames hinted at a darker pattern within the hospital's walls. And beyond those still bodies, another practice was waiting to expose an even harsher truth. Surgery in Victorian hospitals did not begin with preparation or hygiene. It began with whatever tools happened to be available, and with the surgeon's confidence that skill could compensate for everything else. The operating room was often just a corner of the ward, separated by a curtain or nothing at all. Patients lying nearby could hear every movement, every instruction, every cry. The surgeons stepped into this space with sleeves rolled up and hands already marked by the previous patient. In their view, blood on the skin was not a warning. It was simply the residue of work. Surgical tools were kept in wooden boxes or on metal trays, rarely cleaned beyond a quick wipe with a cloth. Dried blood clung to saws, scalpels, and clamps, darkening the blades with each passing day. No one paused to wash them properly. Soap and heat were considered unnecessary. Surgeons believed that diseases were caused by imbalances or bad air, not by microorganisms that lingered on instruments. Because of that ignorance, the tools moved from one body to another without hesitation. Operations were performed quickly. Speed was considered the highest virtue, and a surgeon's reputation depended on how fast he could cut, stitch, or amputate. The longer a patient remained conscious, the more they suffered, and the more likely they were to struggle. With no effective anesthesia, assistants held the patient down, gripping shoulders, arms, or legs, while the surgeon worked. Blood spattered onto aprons, coats, and the floor, forming dark stains that stiffened the fabric. When the procedure ended, the tools were returned to their places, still wet, still contaminated. Surgeons wore long coats that were rarely, if ever, washed. The fabric grew heavy with accumulated blood, turning shades of dark brown and black over time. Instead of signaling danger, the stains became a source of pride. The more marked the coat, the more experienced the surgeon was assumed to be. Medical students looked at these coats with admiration, viewing them as symbols of mastery. Strangely, the coat functioned like a badge of honor, displaying the number of procedures a surgeon had performed. This culture made it nearly impossible to introduce the idea of cleanliness. When reformers suggested washing instruments or hands, many surgeons dismissed the proposal as unnecessary and even insulting. They believed that their skill alone determined success. Blood on the hands to them represented dedication. Blood on the coat represented expertise. Cleanliness in their eyes was something for the weak or overly cautious. As a result, the operating rooms remained dangerous, places shaped more by tradition than by science. The consequences of these practices were devastating. Post-surgical infections were so common that they were considered an expected stage of recovery. Patients developed fevers, swelling, discoloration, and foul odors around their wounds. Some drifted in and out of consciousness as infections spread through their bodies. The surgeons rarely blamed themselves. Instead, they claimed that the patient was inherently weak or that the illness had been too advanced to treat. Death after surgery did not provoke an investigation. It was simply added to the long list of losses. Patients who survived the operation itself often succumbed to infection days later. Their wounds, left exposed or wrapped in unclean cloth, became gateways for bacteria that multiplied rapidly. The room's stale air carried dust and debris settling into wounds without resistance. Flies gathered around open flesh drawn by the scent of blood. Nurses attempted to keep insects away, but their efforts were limited. The hospital environment did not support healing, it supported decay. The lack of sterilization extended to the surgeon's hands as well. Gloves were not used, and washing was rare. Surgeons touched wounds directly, probing with fingers that minutes earlier had touched another patient's blood or bodily fluids. They moved from one operation to the next without pause, believing that their hands were tools rather than carriers of disease. When infections spread, no one recognized the cause. The invisible threat remained outside the knowledge of the era. In amputation cases, the risks were even higher. Surgeons cut through flesh and bone with speed, tossing severed limbs into buckets that filled throughout the day. The wound was then cauterized or stitched as best as possible. Patients screamed or fainted, and those who remained conscious often remembered the smell of burning flesh. But the greatest danger came afterward, when infection took hold. Amputations were meant to save lives, yet many became death sentences. Families visiting post-operative patients often sensed something was wrong before the doctors acknowledged it. They noticed changes in color, the trembling, the strange odors rising from bandages. Their questions, however, were brushed aside. Surgeons insisted that everything was normal, and in a way it was. Infection was normal, decline was normal, death was normal. In the Victorian surgical world, the outcome mattered less than the procedure itself. What made these rooms haunting was not just the suffering they witnessed, but the confidence of those who worked within them. Surgeons genuinely believed they were doing good. They saw their coats as proof, their tools as extensions of their skill, and their methods as necessary. They could not see the harm they caused, because the harm had become part of the profession's identity. And through all of this, patients continued to arrive. They lay on waiting tables, trembling under thin sheets, trusting people who did not yet understand the dangers they carried on their hands and instruments. Surgery offered a chance at survival, but in Victorian hospitals that chance was slim and unpredictable. The operating room, meant to rescue, became a place where risk overshadowed hope. Procedures ended, but the consequences lingered, hidden in wounds that refused to heal. A procedure meant to save often pushes illness further into the body. The quiet acceptance surrounding each operation hinted at a deeper flaw embedded in daily practice. Another layer of danger waited in silence, ready to surface with the next touch of a surgeon's hand. Surgery without anesthesia defined the Victorian hospital experience more than any other practice. Patients were brought into operating spaces fully aware of what awaited them. Some trembled, others stared blankly ahead, and a few tried to speak but found no words strong enough to hold their fear together. The room's cold air settled on their skin while they were placed onto wooden tables or iron-framed beds that shook slightly beneath their weight. Everything that followed depended entirely on their endurance. Doctors valued speed above all else, knowing that a quick procedure reduced the time a patient spent in agony. Yet even the fastest surgeon could not erase pain from the process. Patients remained conscious as knives cut through skin, muscle, and bone. Their breaths turned sharp, their bodies tensed, and sweat gathered on their foreheads. Some gritted their teeth to keep from screaming, but most could not. The moment the blade touched them, pain surged through every nerve, scattering any attempt to remain still. Assistants stood on either side of the patient, gripping arms, legs, or shoulders. Their job was simple: keep the body from moving. They pressed down with all the strength they had, often leaving bruises along the patient's limbs. The person on the table struggled instinctively, pushing against the hands that held them, but resistance meant nothing. Once the surgeon began, movement became irrelevant. The only objective was to endure until the final stitch or final cut. Some surgeries involved amputations, which brought an intensity of pain difficult to imagine. The saw, once placed against the limb, produced vibrations the patient felt deep inside the bone. Muscles spasmed as the surgeon worked with practiced speed, each movement accompanied by gasps or cries that filled the room. Assistants leaned in harder, the entire table shaking with each pull of the blade. The moment the limb separated, the shock often overwhelmed the patient, causing them to slump or lose consciousness. But unconsciousness was rare. Most remained painfully aware of everything happening. Screaming was not discouraged. It was expected. The operating room echoed with it throughout the day. Patients cried out in languages the surgeons did not always understand, or they begged for mercy, or they yelled not at anyone in particular, but because the body demanded it. Nurses walked through the corridors accustomed to the sound. Visitors paused outside the doors, listening with frozen expressions, knowing someone inside was enduring something indescribable. The surgeon's focus never shifted. He worked with precision, sharpened by repetition. He ignored the screams, the twisting limbs, the strained breaths. Pain did not register as a factor in his decisions. It was seen as part of the process, part of the cost of treatment, part of the hospital's identity. To some surgeons, the patient's suffering confirmed the seriousness of the operation. It meant nothing more and nothing less. In the absence of anesthesia, some patients attempted to prepare themselves mentally. They arrived praying, whispering fragments of thoughts, or gripping small objects that held personal meaning. None of these preparations could withstand the shock that followed. Pain cut through even the strongest resolve. Tears formed whether the patient wanted them or not. The sense of losing control overwhelmed many long before the operation ended. After the procedure, patients lay motionless, gasping, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Blood pooled beneath them on the table. Assistants released their grips, rubbing their own sore wrists. The surgeon wiped his tools briefly before moving on to the next case. No one stayed to offer comfort. The patient was carried to a bed, still shaking, often crying quietly into the thin hospital blanket. Their pain continued long after the last cut had been made. For the staff, this cycle became routine. Doctors developed a detachment that allowed them to keep working. Nurses learned to ignore the cries that echoed through the hallways. Visitors walked carefully, hoping not to cross paths with someone being carried in or out of the operating room. Pain was woven into every aspect of hospital life. No one questioned it because no one knew an alternative. The absence of anesthesia shaped how patients viewed the hospital. Many arrived believing that surgery might save them, only to realize that the procedure could break them before it healed anything. Some refused operations altogether, choosing to endure their illness at home rather than submit to the agony of treatment. Families struggled with the decision, torn between hope for recovery and fear of what the surgery would inflict. Even those who survived remembered the experience with a clarity that haunted them. The cutting, the restraint, the pressure of hands, holding them down, these memories lingered long after their bodies began to heal. Some woke at night hearing echoes of the screams they heard in the ward. Others avoided speaking of it, hoping silence could erase what they lived through. But the pain once felt rarely faded. Surgery without anesthesia revealed a belief deeply rooted in Victorian medicine: suffering was unavoidable. It forced patients to confront their fragility in the most direct way possible, exposing their limits in a single concentrated moment. The hospital did not shield them from this reality. It delivered it with a precision as sharp as the surgeon's blade. In the end, the operating room became known not for hope, but for endurance. Each person who entered carried the same fear, and each left marked by pain that could not be forgotten. The hospital expected patients to withstand what their bodies could barely tolerate. Treatment came with a price measured in screams, sweat, and trembling breaths. A procedure meant to help often left a deeper wound than the illness itself. Quiet acceptance hung in the air, as though no other method could exist. A darker layer of hospital life waited nearby, pressing closer with each step through the ward. Cleanliness in Victorian hospitals was not simply neglected. It was treated as a luxury the institutions could not afford. The floors meant to bear the weight of illness became canvases of filth. Blood dried into rust-colored streaks that never fully disappeared, while bodily waste settled into cracks between the boards. Each step stirred old dirt into the air, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay. Patients lying in nearby beds could sense the grime without even touching the floor. The hospital lacked any system to manage waste properly. Buckets of contaminated water were carried outside and dumped wherever space allowed, often near the very windows that overlooked the wards. When it rained, the runoff carried traces of that waste back into the building. The cycle repeated endlessly, reinforcing an environment where illness spread quietly through the smallest movements. The staff accepted this as part of their daily routine, rarely questioning what damage the contamination caused. Footprints marked the hallways, tracking dirt from one room to another. Nurses, visitors, and patients crossed the same corridors unknowingly, spreading whatever clung to the soles of their shoes. No one wiped the floors regularly. Water was scarce, soap scarcer. Cleaning became a matter of appearance rather than sanitation. If a surface looked acceptable from a distance, it was considered clean enough. Closer inspection always revealed stains, smudges, or dust layered thickly enough to dull the original color of the floor. Insects found the hospital ideal for breeding. Flies gathered around open wounds, drawn by the scent of fresh blood. They landed repeatedly on the exposed flesh of patients, leaving behind trails too small to see, but strong enough to worsen infections. Some patients tried to wave them away with weak hands, their movements slow and ineffective. At times, the flies simply returned moments later, undeterred. Nurses swatted at them with cloths, yet their efforts barely changed the swarm. Bedbugs were another constant presence. They nested in seams of mattresses in wooden bed, frames in blankets, folded and reused endlessly. At night, patients felt tiny bites up and down their arms or legs. Scratching was discouraged but unavoidable. Some woke with lines of red marks forming patterns across their skin. These insects feeding quietly and consistently weakened bodies, already struggling to fight disease. The walls offered no refuge. They absorbed moisture, dirt, and smoke from lamps. Their pale surfaces darkened over time, giving them a mottled appearance that looked almost bruised. When a patient leaned against the wall for support, dust transferred easily onto their gown. Some areas smelled of mold. Others carried the heavy odor of soiled bandages discarded too close to the ward. Everything from floor to ceiling contributed to the hospital's oppressive atmosphere. Open wounds suffered most in these conditions. Patients with cuts, amputations, or infections lay exposed to air thick with bacteria long before bacteria were understood. The lack of fresh bandages meant coverings were reused, sometimes still damp from previous patients. When nurses lifted them, strings of dried discharge clung to the cloth. The wound underneath often looked worse than it had days earlier. Healing under such circumstances felt improbable. Doctors did not always notice the effects. Their focus stayed on procedures, diagnoses, or moving quickly through their lists of cases. They saw the dirt, but did not view it as relevant. Illness was expected. Infection was expected. A patient's decline could be blamed on the disease rather than the room surrounding them. This mindset allowed the filth to remain woven into the hospital's daily rhythm. Visitors often reacted more strongly. Some hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether to proceed. The stench alone unsettled them, a mix of sweat, blood, soiled linens, and stagnant water. Those who found the courage to step inside tried to breathe shallowly, hoping to avoid the worst of the smell. Their eyes scanned the floors reluctantly, noticing stains that looked fresh despite having dried long ago. Many left quickly, carrying the memory with them long after the visit ended. For patients, escape was not an option. They lay still on their beds, breathing the same air, feeling insects crawl across their skin, watching dirt collect in corners. Their bodies weakened by sickness, they could not repel the environment. Some accepted it silently. Others cried out in frustration, wishing for even a small sign of care. Yet the hospital remained unchanged, a place where cleanliness was dismissed as unnecessary. The absence of waste management created problems beyond the walls. Animals roamed near dumping sites, carrying contamination back into the hospital through open windows. The odor spread through the neighborhood, marking the area as a place associated with sickness. Residents who lived nearby avoided passing close, yet they knew the hospital's presence affected them whether they stepped inside or not. Despite all this, hospital staff continued their routines. They worked around the filth, stepping over stains, brushing away flies, and shaking dust from blankets. Their familiarity with the environment dulled their concern. What shocked visitors barely registered to those who spent every day within the building. Cleanliness had become a forgotten priority, overshadowed by the relentless flow of patients. The hospital in its state felt like a place where illness accumulated rather than dispersed. The air, the surfaces, the tools all carried traces of previous suffering. People came hoping for relief, yet the environment only added new burdens to their bodies. The filth did not just linger. It shaped the outcome of those who entered. Filth clung to every corner, turning the hospital into a ground where sickness deepened without resistance. Quiet routines moved forward despite contamination drifting through each ward. Something larger pressed beneath these conditions, pointing toward the people whose labor shaped the hospital's most fragile edge. Hospitals in the Victorian era did not merely treat illness, they circulated it. Patients arrived with one condition and often left with another, more severe if they left at all. The wards were crowded with bodies pressed close together, creating an environment where disease moved effortlessly from one person to the next. Air heavy with moisture carried invisible threats drifting from bed to bed without resistance. The smallest cough could land on someone already too weak to fight it. Tuberculosis spread with terrifying ease. Anyone breathing in the same enclosed space risked inhaling droplets that carried the infection. Patients struggled to contain their coughs, but containment was impossible. Fevers burned quietly in some beds. Deep weakness settled in others, while the characteristic rasp of a TB patient echoed through the ward. Those who entered for wounds or minor illnesses found themselves exposed to something far deadlier, something that took hold slowly but relentlessly. Typhoid crept through the hospital in different ways. Contaminated water circulated through the building used for washing clothes, rinsing hands, or filling drinking cups. Waste disposal failures allowed bacteria to linger on surfaces touched by staff and patients alike. People developed stomach cramps, delirium, or fevers without understanding how they had become infected. The hospital beds absorbed these symptoms, adding them to the long list of miseries that defined each ward. Smallpox moved with brutal clarity. Its signs were unmistakable fever rash eruptions, but by the time symptoms appeared, transmission had already occurred. Patients weakened by surgery or infection had little protection against it. Staff, unaware of asymptomatic spread, moved freely among beds carrying the disease on clothing or skin. Entire sections of the hospital sometimes fell ill in waves, leaving ward after ward filled with people suffering identical symptoms. Nosocomial infection, though unnamed for most of the Victorian period, operated like an unspoken sentence. Once someone entered the hospital, they stepped into an environment where illness lingered on blankets, tools, walls, and hands. The risk followed them through every hallway. Wounds, especially those left open after surgery, became easy targets for bacteria. Infections deepened inside the body long before fever revealed the damage. By then, the threat had already become irreversible. Ventilation offered little relief. Windows were small, often sealed shut during cold months. Air turned stale, quickly carrying odors thick with disease. Visitors sensed danger immediately upon entering. Some hesitated to cross the threshold, but patients had no choice. Their bodies absorbed whatever drifted through the room. No barrier separated the infected from the vulnerable. Every breath came with the possibility of decline. Doctors moved swiftly through the wards, unaware that they themselves served as carriers. Coats soaked in blood or fluids from earlier procedures brushed against bed frames. Hands touched multiple patients without washing. Tools moved from one environment to another, bringing invisible traces of infection with them. Staff believed they were providing care, yet each step they took intensified the spread. Patients watched these movements with silent unease. They observed doctors leaning over beds, coughing, staff members wiping sweat with bare hands, nurses switching cloths between patients. Some sensed the danger, but could not identify its cause. They only knew that people who arrived with manageable conditions often worsened days later, unraveling in ways that felt sudden, yet predictable. Whispers travelled through the ward. Someone down the row had caught a fever, someone across the room had begun vomiting. Someone who had seemed stable now struggled to breathe. Families brought food, blankets or letters, unknowingly introducing new microorganisms from the outside. Likewise, they carried infections back to their homes after visiting sick relatives. The hospital served not only as a place where disease multiplied, but as a node from which disease radiated outward into the city. Entire neighborhoods suffered because hospitals lacked the knowledge or tools needed to control the spread. Some staff recognized patterns of disease transmission, though they could not explain them scientifically. They noticed that wards with many coughing patients experienced higher mortality. They observed that wounds exposed to air in certain rooms deteriorated faster. They even suspected that the proximity of beds played a role. But these observations remained intuitive, lacking the evidence required to convince others. Tradition, ignorance, and poverty prevented meaningful reform. Patients understood their vulnerability in different ways. Some lay awake at night listening to the sounds of illness moving through the room. Others watched neighbors decline and feared they would follow. Each new cough felt like a warning. Each fever, reported by a nurse, signaled that danger had drawn closer. People who once worried only about their original condition now feared the diseases spreading around them. Nosocomial infections shaped the hospital's reputation. Entering the building meant stepping into a web of overlapping dangers, each capable of destroying a weakened body. For many, the hospital was not a place to escape illness, but a place where illness deepened, strengthened, and found new victims. Those who survived attributed it to luck rather than treatment. The environment remained unchanged, steady in its indifference. Beds filled, emptied, and filled again. Contaminated air moved through the ward as predictably as the sunrise. Patients inhaled it without resistance. Bacteria claimed space in wounds without challenge. Hospitals carried on unaware that their most consistent contribution to medicine was the sickness they unintentionally nurtured. Illness moved freely through the wards, turning survival into something fragile. Quiet acceptance formed around this pattern, influencing each patient who entered. Shadows within the hospital pointed toward deeper cracks in its structure, reaching into the very roles meant to provide care. Nursing in Victorian hospitals operated without structure training or expectation of professionalism. The women who filled these roles often came from backgrounds marked by poverty, hardship, or criminal records. Literacy was uncommon among them, yet literacy was never considered necessary for the work they were assigned. Hospitals needed bodies more than skills, so anyone willing to endure long hours in filthy wards became a nurse by default. Their presence reflected desperation rather than intention. These women entered rooms where suffering had already taken root. They stepped between beds, crowded with patients, carrying cloths damp with old blood or pails brimming with waste. Each task they performed was learned through repetition rather than instruction. No one demonstrated proper technique. No one enforced standards. One nurse observed, another copied her movements, and carried on as though knowledge had been passed down through formal lessons. In truth, nothing structured existed. Workloads were relentless. Floors needed wiping, even if the wiping smeared more than it removed. Bandages needed collecting, rinsing, and reusing, despite stains that never fully disappeared. Clothing soaked in bodily fluids had to be scrubbed until the water turned murky. Patients who attempted to rise or wander had to be restrained gently or forcefully depending on their condition. Nurses spent their days shifting between these tasks, without rest, treating the hospital less like a medical facility and more like a household in constant disarray. Discipline came not from supervisors but from necessity. Nurses complied with orders from doctors unquestioningly. They lifted limbs, held bodies, still prepared rooms, or emptied containers without complaint. Their voices rarely entered conversations about treatment. Decisions about patient care remained entirely in the hands of physicians who viewed nurses as extensions of physical labor rather than collaborators. This dynamic shaped the atmosphere of the wards, where silence became a requirement rather than a choice. The emotional demands of the job received no recognition. Nurses witnessed death frequently, sometimes multiple times in a single shift. They watched patients tremble with fever, gasp for air, or bleed onto sheets that would later become their responsibility to clean. Fear never left the building. It settled into every corner. Yet nurses continued working, accustomed to exhaustion so deep it shaped their posture. Their bodies carried the weight of tasks no one else wanted to perform. Conditions outside the wards mirrored conditions within. Many nurses lived in poverty, surviving on wages barely sufficient for shelter or food. Those who had escaped criminal pasts found limited opportunities elsewhere, so hospital work became both punishment and salvation. They entered each day, knowing the environment offered little safety. Their clothing absorbed smells from the hospital. Their hands grew rough from scrubbing walls and lifting patients. Their health deteriorated, slowly worn down by exposure to infection. The gap between doctors and nurses widened through visible habits. Doctors wore coats stained deeply from past procedures, while nurses wore garments patched repeatedly, evidence of limited resources. Doctors walked through halls with purpose, speaking decisively. Nurses moved quickly, yet quietly responding, rather than initiating. The hierarchy defined every moment of interaction. Even when nurses noticed errors or risks, they rarely mentioned them. Silence protected their employment. Training remained non-existent. No lessons addressed hygiene, sanitation, or patient care. No instruction explained how to handle wounds, fevers, or delirium. Knowledge came from observation only. Mistakes became common, though rarely acknowledged. If a patient declined unexpectedly, blame shifted to the disease rather than inadequate care. Nurses continued repeating routines without improvement, because no one guided them toward better methods. Despite lacking formal skills, nurses held responsibilities essential to the hospital's survival. They lifted patients during procedures, wiped sweat during fever spikes, and steadied heads or limbs during painful operations. Their hands carried the burden of physical contact, performing tasks physicians avoided. They also handled the labor of cleaning, washing linens, scrubbing floors, and emptying bedpans, tasks crucial to maintaining any semblance of order within the ward. Their work extended beyond cleaning. Nurses provided basic comfort to those who lay alone for hours. They lifted cups to dry lips, adjusted blankets on trembling bodies, and whispered reassurance when voices failed. Yet none of these contributions entered official records. In the eyes of the system, their value came from physical labor rather than human presence. Patients viewed nurses with mixed reactions. Some appreciated the attention, sensing kindness beneath exhaustion. Others associated nurses with discomfort, since these women enforced restraint or performed tasks that caused pain. Fear and gratitude lived side by side in the wards. Patients understood nurses possessed little control over treatment, but significant influence over daily survival. The absence of structured training created cycles of inexperience. New nurses learned from those who lacked proper instruction themselves, repeating flawed routines that shaped outcomes for countless patients. Hospitals tolerated this because replacing staff proved difficult. Anyone willing to endure the work received acceptance regardless of skill. The institution depended on bodies, not knowledge. Through these conditions, nursing remained both indispensable and undervalued. Nurses carried the hospital's weight, though few noticed. Disease moved through wards freely, yet these women continued their tasks, performing duties that blurred the line between care and maintenance. Their labor kept hospitals functioning even while the environment undermined each patient's chance of recovery. Nurses performed work without guidance, leaving patients dependent on routines built from trial rather than knowledge. Silence filled the space where training should have existed. A deeper crisis waited nearby, tied directly to wounds left open to hospital air. Surgical wounds in Victorian hospitals remained open long after procedures ended. Patients lay on beds with incisions exposed to air, thick with dust, moisture, and remnants from previous cases. Bandages were scarce, often reused until the cloth turned stiff from dried fluids. Many wounds received no covering at all. Surgeons believed fresh air encouraged healing, unaware that exposure invited infections capable of overpowering the strongest bodies. The decision to leave wounds uncovered reflected confidence built on misunderstanding rather than evidence. Flies entered through windows or clung to clothing brought in from outside. Drawn by the scent of blood or pus, they landed directly on open wounds. Their legs carried particles invisible to the eye, each landing deepening the patient's risk. Nurses brushed them away repeatedly, yet they returned without hesitation. Patients felt wings brushing their skin or heard soft buzzing near incisions, powerless to stop it. Some attempted to shield their wounds with trembling hands, but exhaustion made the effort fleeting. The presence of insects became part of the room, as ordinary as tools on nearby tables. Surgeons performed operations without washing their hands. They moved from one patient to another, quickly eager to complete long lists of procedures before daylight faded. Their hands, stained from earlier work, touched fresh incisions without hesitation. Coats marked by old blood hung heavily from their shoulders. These coats symbolized experience to those who admired them, yet they served as silent carriers of infection. Nothing prompted surgeons to question their methods. Germs remained unknown, leaving contamination invisible and therefore irrelevant. Tools received similar neglect. Knives, saws, and clamps retained residue from previous operations. Instruments were wiped on cloths or rinsed briefly, but thorough cleaning never occurred. When metal met flesh, traces of earlier patients transferred into new wounds, deepening infection before healing could begin. Some patients noticed discoloration on tools or cloths, but lacked the strength to protest. Others trusted the surgeon's authority, believing everything used in procedures had a purpose. Rooms where operations took place offered little defense against contamination. Floors bore stains across wide patches, remnants from countless surgeries. Walls absorbed moisture and odors from open wounds. Tables held indentations where fluids had pooled, creating surfaces difficult to clean. The air circulated slowly heavy, with particles stirred by movement. Every object within these rooms contributed to the risk surrounding each patient. Patients responded differently to these conditions. Some developed fevers within hours, while others declined gradually. Swelling near incisions thickened day by day. Discoloration spread outward, turning skin dark or mottled. Discharge collected around the edges of wounds, forming crusts. Nurses attempted to remove with cloths that held contamination of their own. Pain intensified, pulsing with each heartbeat. Some patients moaned softly, others clenched their teeth until exhaustion overwhelmed them. Surgeons often dismissed early signs of infection. Fever, delirium, or worsening pain were viewed as expected complications rather than warnings. Nurses reported changes, yet doctors responded with reassurance minimal in substance. The concept of bacteria had not entered medical understanding, so infections were attributed to patient weakness or environmental conditions beyond control. This belief persisted even as wards filled with similar patterns of decline. Nurses attempted to manage symptoms using methods available to them. They applied warm cloths, changed the positions of patients, or whispered encouragement. Their efforts, however, did little to halt infections embedded deep within tissue. Some nurses recognized patterns. Patients left with uncovered wounds fared worse, but lacked the knowledge to articulate why. They endured emotional weight, daily watching incision after incision worsen despite care. Victims of open wound exposure often relied on luck rather than treatment. Those with strong constitutions survived longer, though survival never guaranteed recovery. Others slipped quickly into septic conditions marked by high fever, chills, and confusion. Death followed quietly or violently, depending on how far infection had progressed. The hospital absorbed these losses without pause, replacing emptied beds with new patients, unaware of the risks waiting for them. Families visiting loved ones struggled to understand why conditions deteriorated so quickly. They entered rooms expecting improvement, but found swollen limbs, discolored wounds, or breathing labored by fever. Some questioned nurses who offered answers shaped by limited knowledge. Surgeons rarely appeared during visiting hours, leaving relatives with uncertainty that settled heavily in their minds. Many returned home carrying fear that extended beyond hospital walls. Open wounds symbolized something larger. Hospitals operated without the knowledge essential for safeguarding patients. Procedures focused on the removal or repair of damaged parts but ignored invisible threats entering through each incision. The system upheld traditions formed long before scientific understanding matured. Observations that should have prompted questions instead became routine, reinforcing patterns that cost countless lives. Through every ward, through every corridor, untreated wounds reflected the core weakness of Victorian medicine. Patients placed trust in methods built on an incomplete understanding. Surgeons continued their work without awareness of the harm they carried with them. Nurses endured the burden of caring for bodies harmed not only by illness, but by the environment intended to heal them. Open wounds lay exposed to everything, drifting through the ward, turning recovery into something uncertain. Quiet acceptance formed around these outcomes, shaping expectations for each patient lying in those beds. Deeper concerns gathered nearby, tied closely to how hospitals treated those unable to protect themselves. Poor patients entered Victorian hospitals with limited choices, often pushed through doors by illness, exhaustion, or desperation. Their presence offered opportunities for physicians seeking bodies on which to test new techniques or unproven treatments. Consent never entered these exchanges. Vulnerable people lie in beds without awareness that their conditions place them at risk of becoming subjects rather than patients. Hospitals became spaces where survival depended on circumstance more than intention. Doctors approached poor wards with confidence shaped by authority rather than evidence. They believed experimentation held value for medical progress, though progress came at the expense of those unable to resist. New instruments, newly mixed medicines, or unfamiliar surgical methods found their first trials in these rooms. Physicians documented observations, quietly recording reactions, without acknowledging that each body represented life entrusted to their care. Experiments became steps in careers, not negotiations with frightened patients. Medicines prepared for trials varied widely in composition. Some contained strong chemicals meant to purge illness. Others included mixtures believed to stimulate healing, but lacked proof of effectiveness. Physicians administered these substances directly, watching patients endure severe discomfort spasms or sudden declines. When symptoms worsened, doctors adjusted dosages rather than questioning the method itself. Patients could only lie still, trapped between hope for recovery and fear of worsening conditions. Procedures performed on poor patients often came with heightened risks. Surgeons attempted new incisions or removed tissue, using techniques untested on others. Their movements displayed confidence, yet outcomes remained unpredictable. Some patients survived, though often with long-term consequences. Others deteriorated quickly. Surgeons viewed these results as lessons rather than tragedies. Each death contributed knowledge without prompting responsibility. Public wards offered little privacy. Observers crowded into rooms during experimental procedures. Medical students, apprentices, or curious staff gathered beside beds, watching every movement of the physician's hands. Patients already weak endured these moments without dignity. Their presence served educational purposes more than personal healing. Voices discussing anatomy technique or expected outcomes filled the space, ignoring the suffering unfolding beneath them. Families seldom learned the full truth. When relatives visited, doctors described outcomes as unfortunate complications or natural progressions of illness. Details regarding experimental treatments remained concealed behind medical language. Poor families lacked both power and education to question these explanations. Grief overwhelmed them, leaving little room for suspicion. Death certificates reported acceptable causes, preserving the reputations of those responsible. Hospitals rarely document failures transparently. If patients died during or after experimental procedures, records listed conditions that masked underlying causes. Poor people, already undervalued by society, became numbers rather than lives. Their deaths carried minimal consequences. No inquiries, no investigations. Staff continued with routines uninterrupted, clearing beds for others who would unknowingly face similar risks. Physicians justified these actions by claiming poor wards offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Wealthier patients demanded assurances, resources, or second opinions. The poor had none of these. Their silence created conditions physicians interpreted as permission. Experiments expanded because no one objected explicitly. Social hierarchy shaped medical ethics far more deeply than compassion. Some nurses recognized the danger. They observed physicians discussing upcoming trials at bedsides. They watched patients deteriorate rapidly after receiving treatments not used in other wards. Yet nurses lacking authority remained silent. Their warnings, if spoken at all, failed to change decisions made by those with influence. Power operated above them, shaping outcomes beyond their control. Poor patients developed awareness slowly. Some noticed unfamiliar tools appearing during rounds or heard conversations between physicians. Others sensed that their treatments differed from those applied to wealthier individuals. Fear grew, quietly settling into thoughts during sleepless nights. They knew refusal carried consequences. Doctors controlled their food, water, and placement within the ward. Submission became survival, even when survival felt uncertain. Experimental deaths accumulated. Bodies weakened by illness collapsed further under treatments designed without understanding. Some patients suffered violent reactions, trembling, struggling to breathe, or slipping into unconsciousness. Others declined gradually, fever rising steadily until exhaustion consumed them. Wards witnessed these patterns often enough to recognize them, yet recognition changed nothing. Medical journals occasionally referenced insights gained from trials conducted in poor wards. These articles described symptoms, reactions, or procedural outcomes without naming patients or acknowledging the suffering endured. Knowledge moved forward quietly while victims remained invisible. Society accepted these advances because the cost fell on those least able to resist. Hospitals defended their actions through claims of necessity. They argued that limited resources required difficult decisions. They insisted that poor patients received opportunities for treatment unavailable elsewhere. These justifications masked exploitation, allowing experimentation to continue without public scrutiny. Only rare cases drew attention, when outcomes proved too shocking to ignore. Through these practices, hospitals revealed deeper truths about Victorian society. Poverty determined whose bodies could be used, whose suffering could be overlooked, whose death carried no consequence. Experimental treatments performed on poor patients reflected structural cruelty embedded in medical institutions. Illness made them vulnerable. Poverty made them expendable. The wards absorbed these losses quietly. Beds filled, emptied, then filled again. New patients arrived unaware of histories shaping the space they now occupied. Physicians continued trials, believing progress required sacrifice. Those sacrifices fell consistently on the same group. Hospitals survived through this imbalance, reinforcing a cycle that defined treatment for generations. Experiments pushed vulnerable patients into risks hidden behind quiet authority. Suffering deepened through decisions made without consent. Further harm waited nearby, directed toward women whose bodies faced dangers unique to their circumstances. Childbirth in Victorian hospitals carried dangers hidden beneath ordinary routines. Women arrived exhausted, their bodies weakened by long labor or poverty, seeking assistance from physicians they believed could provide safety. Instead, they entered wards where disease lingered quietly, waiting for moments of vulnerability. Midwives held limited authority, while doctors, unaware of invisible threats, performed examinations with hands bearing traces of previous patients. Blood, sweat, or other fluids coated their skin, yet no concern arose regarding cleanliness. Puerperal fever became one of the most feared outcomes. It struck women hours or days after giving birth, igniting fevers that rose without restraint. Pain deepened, traveling from abdomen to limbs in waves that left mothers delirious. Physicians attributed this to weakness or natural complications, unaware that their own unwashed hands transferred harmful agents directly into women's bodies. Surgeons who had just performed autopsies often moved to maternity wards without hesitation, believing experience justified their presence everywhere. Hospitals lacked separation between patients suffering from infectious diseases and women preparing for childbirth. Beds stood close together, forming rows where coughs traveled freely. Tuberculosis spread through the air, thickened by humidity from soiled linens. Typhoid moved silently across contaminated surfaces. Newborn babies, breathing weakly inhaled pathogens, carried from nearby patients lying in the throes of fever. Their bodies, fragile and unprepared, succumbed quickly. Mothers noticed signs early, infants crying softly at first, then refusing to feed, skin developing unusual tones, breathing becoming uneven. Nurses, stretched thin and burdened by endless tasks, attempted soothing measures, but lacked the knowledge to prevent decline. When infants trembled or grew cold, death approached rapidly. Families rarely received explanations. Loss was attributed to fate rather than systemic failure. Poor women faced the highest risks. In homes with insufficient resources, they endured hardships daily, yet childbirth there sometimes offered better outcomes than hospitals. Clean surroundings, familiar hands, and distance from infectious wards provided certain protections. Hospitals conversely exposed women to dangers disguised as professional care. Poverty pushed them through hospital doors, not trust. During labor, noise filled the maternity wards. Groans mixed with cries while nurses hurried between beds, holding cloths or buckets. Physicians arrived intermittently, giving instructions shaped by confidence rather than understanding. Their methods remained consistent, though outcomes varied wildly. Some women survived childbirth only to collapse days later from fever. Others never recovered from blood loss or shock. Babies are born into a world surrounded by uncertainty. Many procedures introduced additional hazards. Instruments used during examinations were rarely cleaned properly. Metallic surfaces bore residue from previous patients. When inserted or applied, they transferred contamination deep inside women already at risk. Surgeons defended their actions by emphasizing the necessity of intervention, though necessity often masked ignorance. The temperature within maternity wards fluctuated between stifling heat and biting cold. Windows remained closed during winter, trapping odors from soiled sheets, sweat, and lingering infections. Air stagnated, drifting through rows of beds without circulation. Summers brought different challenges, with flies entering through cracks drawn by blood or fluids left behind on clothes. Nurses waved them away, yet they returned repeatedly, landing on newborn faces or exposed incisions. Mothers watched other women decline and sensed danger heading toward them. They listened to fevers rising in nearby beds, heard delirious murmurs from those slipping into unconsciousness, and waited for their own symptoms to appear. Even women who delivered healthy children felt anxiety settle into their bodies as they lay in shared rooms filled with sickness. Doctors rarely acknowledged patterns. They recorded deaths as unfortunate complications, unaware of their role in the cycle. Some hospitals attempted improvements by increasing ventilation or washing linens more regularly, yet these efforts lacked consistency. Training focused on procedures rather than hygiene. Knowledge traveled slowly, hindered by tradition. Families brought food or blankets during visits, hoping to comfort mothers and infants. They entered rooms where air stung their noses, surprised by the odor of illness surrounding childbirth. Concern rose quickly, yet their presence offered limited protection. Visits remained brief, controlled by staff, leaving families with lingering worry once they stepped outside. Women who survived puerperal fever carried long-term consequences. Weakness persisted for months. Some lost mobility or suffered chronic pain. Infants who survived early exposure sometimes developed persistent coughs or frailty that shaped their lives. Poverty amplified these burdens, trapping families in cycles of struggle for generations. Maternity wards mirrored broader issues within Victorian hospitals. They highlighted how limited understanding shaped outcomes. They revealed the consequences of neglect, disguised as normal practice. Lives ended not because childbirth was inherently deadly, but because care failed to recognize threats drifting through each room. Each death exposed fragility within medical systems, built on misplaced confidence. Despite suffering, mothers continued arriving. Poverty, isolation, or complicated pregnancies pushed them forward. Hope led them to seek care, though the care received fell short. They lay on thin mattresses stained from previous births, gripping the edges of beds while contractions surged. Nurses leaned close, guiding breathing. Doctors observed briefly before leaving, unaware their presence introduced risks. Through every birth, every fever spike, every failed attempt to save infants, hospitals displayed truths hidden behind professional authority. Women endured danger quietly, trusting systems that placed them in harm's path. Their stories traveled through neighborhoods, slowly whispered among families, yet change remained distant. Mothers entered wards, seeking safety only to confront risks embedded in every corner. Quiet resignation accompanied each loss, deepening fear within those still waiting to deliver. Something harsher waited nearby, directed toward women whose bodies faced scrutiny beyond medical purpose. Doctors in Victorian hospitals held immense authority, often moving through wards with confidence, built on training that lacked critical knowledge. Their presence commanded silence, respect, and obedience. Patients watched them approach with hope, believing expertise would guide them toward recovery. Yet those same hands, coated with unseen remnants from previous patients, carried dangers no one recognized. Lives ended quietly because harmful practices remained accepted as routine. Physicians often worked long days without breaks. They examined bodies covered in wounds, then walked immediately into maternity wards, then into surgical rooms, repeating tasks without washing. Sweat, blood, or fluids clung to skin and clothing. Their coats grew heavy, marked by streaks from earlier procedures. These coats symbolized skill to observers, yet they held residues that could settle into open wounds or vulnerable bodies. Doctors believed experience protected them from error, though experience concealed risks. A single physician could cause multiple deaths within weeks, simply by moving through wards as expected. Each examination transferred particles invisible to the eye. Each touch deepened exposure to harmful organisms. When patients declined quickly after contact, families saw it as a misfortune. No one questioned whether the doctor's hands carried hidden threats. Physicians held unquestioned authority. Their decisions shaped outcomes without scrutiny. Complaints rarely surfaced. Society viewed doctors as figures beyond fault. Their education placed them above criticism, while patients possessed neither power nor knowledge to challenge them. Even when death followed a series of examinations or procedures, explanations returned to illness rather than practice. Physicians delivered these conclusions with certainty, reinforcing trust rather than doubt. Some nurses observed troubling patterns. They noticed infections spreading after certain doctors made rounds. They recognized symptoms emerging days after examinations performed with hands stained from prior cases. Yet nurses lacked the authority to speak openly. Their voices remained quiet, overshadowed by the respect granted to physicians. Fear of dismissal, punishment, or ridicule silenced them further. Surgical procedures highlighted dangers more clearly. Doctors approached tables without washing or changing garments. Tools carried residue despite being wiped hurriedly. When hands pressed into tissue or moved across incisions, contamination entered deep within bodies, already weakened by pain or illness. Surgeons attributed resulting infections to patient constitution, never their own habits. Each death became unfortunate but acceptable. Florence Nightingale, observing conditions firsthand, began questioning these practices. She noticed patterns. Others ignored clusters of infections linked to specific routines, mortality rising in wards where cleanliness held no priority, wounds worsening after contact with unwashed hands. Her suspicions introduced a radical idea that disease could travel through touch. Yet her observations faced resistance. Tradition outweighed evidence in hospitals governed by senior physicians. Public perception remained unchanged. Newspapers praised doctors for dedication and sacrifice. Stories highlighting successful treatments overshadowed countless failures. Hospitals defended physicians, fiercely shielding them from criticism. When mortality surged, blame fell on overcrowding, poor patient health, or unpredictable disease. Few pointed to the hands guiding examinations. Within wards, patients sensed danger indirectly. They noticed fevers rising after visits from certain doctors. They watched wounds darken, swell, or discharge thick fluids. They heard groans from neighboring beds, where decline accelerated shortly after examinations. Yet fear prevented them from protesting. Refusing treatment from a doctor could result in neglect or removal from care entirely. Even when evidence accumulated, system inertia prevented change. Physicians continued performing examinations as they always had. They touched linen stained with old blood, then handled newborns moments later. They left autopsy rooms carrying traces of death, then stepped into wards filled with vulnerable bodies. Their hands moved with practiced ease, unaware of consequences. The environment reinforced these behaviors. Hospitals lacked space for proper washing. Water supplies remained limited. Soap held little priority. Instruments rested on tables without thorough cleaning. Light dimmed in corridors, revealing little before it was too late. Everything encouraged routine rather than reflection. Doctors performed tasks quickly, unaware that each movement shaped life or death. Patients dying after examinations formed patterns hidden within statistics. Families mourned quietly, accepting explanations provided by physicians. Medical language masked responsibility. Death certificates listed fever, exhaustion, infection, or complications. No document mentioned hands carrying harmful particles. No report questioned the doctor's behavior. Nightingale's early observations planted seeds of doubt within medical practice. She documented mortality rates, carefully comparing wards with different conditions. She noticed improved outcomes where cleanliness held priority, even without a full understanding of bacteria. Her data suggested connections others had overlooked. Still, progress remained slow. Hospitals clung to tradition. Through each ward, the consequences of unwashed hands repeated endlessly. Women in childbirth developed fevers days after examinations. Surgical wounds darkened quickly. Infants failed to thrive. Patients recovering from minor issues collapsed suddenly. Doctors continued rounds, unaware of their role in these events, their authority shielding them from realization. Victorian hospitals displayed faith in expertise, despite evidence of harm. Trust overshadowed caution. Patients surrendered their bodies to physicians without question. Families deferred judgment. Nurses worked silently, trapped between observation and obedience. The cycle deepened with every unwashed hand, every contaminated tool, every unquestioned routine. Doctor confidence overshadowed the dangers drifting from their unwashed hands, weaving decline into bodies seeking care. Quiet acceptance surrounded their authority, limiting scrutiny from those who suffered consequences. Pressure within hospitals shifted toward public procedures, where suffering unfolded before the watching eyes. Operations in Victorian hospitals often unfolded before crowded rooms filled with spectators. Surgeons treated procedures as demonstrations, drawing students, assistants, and curious observers into operating theatres, built like stages. Wooden benches rose in circles around central tables, where patients lay trembling. Voices whispered through the gallery as people settled into their seats, watching every movement of the surgeon's hands. Patients sensed eyes bearing down on them from all directions, yet no one offered comfort. Consent was never entered into discussions. Patients were positioned without question, their bodies arranged for visibility rather than dignity. Surgeons spoke loudly enough for onlookers to hear, describing techniques, instruments, or expected outcomes. Students leaned forward eagerly, notebooks ready. Assistants moved efficiently, preparing tools that still carried residue from earlier operations. The atmosphere carried excitement rather than caution, as though suffering below served an educational purpose only. Some patients remained conscious during these procedures. Their groans or screams echoed through the theatre, rising toward the high ceiling. Surgeons, determined to maintain composure, focused solely on their work. Observers whispered comments, evaluating the technique or predicting the results. Pain became background noise. Blood spilled freely across sheets, pooling in grooves carved into wooden tables. Fluids dripped onto the floor, leaving stains that blended into marks from previous operations. When patients fainted, surgeons viewed it as relief. Unconscious bodies offered fewer disruptions. Yet if patients collapsed before incisions, staff splashed water on their faces or struck them lightly to revive them. The goal centered on demonstration rather than patient well-being. No one paused to consider emotional terror gripping those lying beneath countless watching eyes. Fear became an unspoken part of the experience. Students learning under these circumstances grew accustomed to suffering. They watched limbs removed swiftly or wounds opened without anesthesia. Surgeons valued speed. Quicker procedures reduced time for panic or movement. Observers timed operations, praising surgeons who finished efficiently. Errors, though apparent, received minimal acknowledgement. Spectacle overshadowed precision. Operating rooms lacked ventilation. Heat from crowded galleries mixed with the smell of blood, sweat, and decay. Some observers struggled to remain upright, as sense overwhelmed them. Yet fainting students often received no help until surgeons decided demonstrations could pause briefly. Patients who fainted during procedures remained untouched until surgeons resumed. Everything revolved around instruction, never compassion. Theatres themselves encouraged detachment. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted, murmuring about technique or debating future innovations. Light streamed unevenly through windows, illuminating dust drifting through the air. Shadows fell across patient bodies, contrasting sharply with pale, exposed skin. No privacy existed. Each incision became public knowledge, each mistake shared by dozens of witnesses. Spectators sometimes reacted strongly. Gasps rippled across the benches during difficult moments. Some whispered encouragement to surgeons rather than patients. Others pressed handkerchiefs to their noses, attempting to mask odors rising from the table. When blood spurted unexpectedly, students either recoiled or leaned forward with heightened curiosity. Observing pain became a routine requirement. Patients lacked the opportunity to refuse participation. Poverty left them with limited access to care outside hospitals. Doctors viewed refusal as unreasonable, dismissing concerns as fear or ignorance. Families rarely understood the procedures performed. They heard descriptions vague enough to hide the truth. Many believed operations took place privately, unaware of crowds bearing witness. Assistants played crucial roles. They held limbs steady, wiped sweat from surgeons' brows, or passed instruments quickly. Their faces remained expressionless, accustomed to scenes unfolding daily. They learned to ignore patient cries, focusing instead on the surgeon's needs. Their silence served as reinforcement for students observing from above. After procedures ended, surgeons addressed the audience with reflections on technique or promising outcomes. Patients lay unconscious or trembling, barely acknowledged. Surgeons exited theatres proudly, leaving nurses to manage the aftermath. Cleaning required hours. Blood clung to surfaces stubbornly. Instruments piled in basins, awaiting minimal rinsing. Nurses whispered among themselves about procedures gone poorly, though their opinions held little influence. Some hospitals attempted reforms, limiting spectators or emphasizing patient dignity. Yet many resisted change, viewing operating theatres as essential training areas. Surgeons defended tradition passionately, insisting techniques required open observation. They ignored the emotional and physical tolls on patients. Reformers challenging these practices faced criticism for undermining medical education. Those who survived operations often carried lasting trauma. They remembered dozens of eyes watching as incisions opened. They recalled voices discussing their bodies coldly as though detached from suffering. Many endured nightmares long after discharge. Others struggled to speak about experience, fearing disbelief or dismissal. Hospitals rarely consider psychological impacts. Students who trained in these environments entered careers shaped by desensitization. They learned to value procedure speed, technical performance, and composure. Compassion rarely entered the curriculum. Their understanding of surgery was formed through witnessing suffering, displayed publicly, turning pain into a spectacle rather than a signal of harm. These habits continued years after training ended. Families visiting patients recovering from public operations saw evidence of trauma clearly. They noticed trembling hands, distant expressions, or refusal to discuss experience. Nurses observed similar signs but lacked the authority to voice concerns. Doctors focused solely on physical results, ignoring emotional damage. Recovery in their minds ended when wounds closed. Theatres were slowly phased out as understanding of hygiene, ethics, and patient dignity evolved. Yet their legacy remained carved into medical history. Countless patients endured procedures treated as performances. Their suffering advanced education while damaging trust in institutions meant to heal. Hospitals defended these practices until evidence overwhelming enough forced reconsideration. Through these scenes, Victorian medicine revealed a commitment to training rather than humane care. Patients served as stepping stones for students. Their pain was transformed into lessons. Operating theatres shaped generations of physicians, embedding detachment into medical culture that persisted far beyond Victorian years. Public operations reduced suffering to demonstration, leaving patients trapped within routines shaped by tradition rather than compassion. Quiet endurance remained the only constant for those placed on tables beneath watching eyes. Further strain gathered within the hospital, tied closely to tools reused long after they should have been set aside. Surgical instruments in Victorian hospitals carried histories from countless previous patients. Metal tools rested on wooden tables worn smooth by years of repeated use. Knives bore scratches along their edges, grooves holding residue from earlier incisions. Saws displayed darkened teeth, where dried blood clung stubbornly. Clamps carried rust in corners where cloth could not reach. Instruments rarely received proper cleaning. Instead, they were wiped briskly on cloths, already stained from earlier operations, leaving behind traces too small for surgeons to notice, but large enough to enter new wounds. Surgeons valued efficiency. They reached for tools quickly, trusting familiar weight and shape rather than cleanliness. Operations required speed, especially without anesthesia. Instruments moved from patient to patient with little time between procedures. Assistants stood ready with basins of murky water intended for rinsing. The water darkened throughout the day, collecting residue from one operation after another. No one changed it frequently. Surgeons dipped blades into it briefly, shook off droplets, then resumed cutting. During amputations, saws gripped bone with harsh precision. Each pull sent splinters and fragments into the surrounding flesh. The rhythmic scraping echoed through operating rooms. Blood sprayed across nearby surfaces, coating handles and metal edges. Surgeons continued without pause. The urgency of keeping patients still outweighed contamination concerns. Assistants held limbs firmly, ignoring fluids running over their hands. Every movement carried remnants of earlier suffering. Knives dulled quickly. Surgeons pressed harder to compensate, dragging edges across skin that resisted more than expected. Dull blades created jagged wounds. These wounds widened the infection risk dramatically, though no one recognized this at the time. Tools believed to be reliable in form hid dangers in function. Metal left behind microscopic debris, while transporting contaminants invisibly from one patient to the next. Clamps used to control bleeding, retained dried tissue from earlier operations. Surgeons snapped them into place, without inspecting surfaces. When clamps are released, residue is sometimes transferred directly into wounds. Patients lay unconscious or restrained, unable to voice discomfort beyond muffled cries. Surgeons expected pain. Pain required no explanation. Observers watching from galleries focused on technique rather than debris spreading across instruments. Instruments dropped during procedures posed additional risks. If a knife or clamp fell to the floor, assistants retrieved it, quickly wiped it on whatever cloth was closest, and then returned it to the surgeon. Floors bore stains from years of operations, yet no one hesitated to reuse fallen tools. Time mattered more than caution. Surgeons insisted procedures continue without delay. Patients lying on tables could not predict these silent moments of risk. Even storage offered no protection. Instruments sat in open trays exposed to dust drifting through the wards. Cloth coverings, when used, rarely stayed clean for long. Air carried particles from nearby beds filled with infection. Tools collected these particles invisibly, day after day. No sterilization methods existed. Boiling or heating instruments occurred, rarely considered unnecessary. Tradition guided preparations more than science. After the procedures ended, nurses gathered the instruments quickly. They placed blades and clamps into basins filled with water, clouded by blood pus or other fluids. Scrubbing remained inconsistent, limited by time and exhaustion. Nurses worked through piles of soiled linens, bandages, and tools simultaneously. They cleaned surfaces until stains faded, though fading never equaled removal. Instruments re-entered rotation within hours. Patients bore the consequences of these practices. Infections spread rapidly through wounds cut by contaminated blades. Fever rose within days, accompanied by swelling discoloration or foul-smelling discharge. Surgeons responded by reopening wounds or attempting additional procedures, unaware that instruments further deepened infection. Mortality increased, yet explanations never questioned the tools themselves. Blame returned to patient weakness or mysterious bad air. Families visiting patients sensed something unsettling. They noticed instruments lying openly on tables beside beds. Some observed stains along metal surfaces. Few understood the implications, though discomfort lingered. They trusted surgeons to maintain safety, unaware of risks embedded within each tool. Conversations with doctors offered reassurance without substance. Students learning surgical techniques observed tool use closely. They admired the decisiveness of motions, the confidence surgeons displayed when selecting instruments. Lessons focused on skill, precision, or anatomical landmarks. No instruction addressed contamination. Students repeated behaviors modeled before them, believing tradition carried wisdom. Mistakes became accepted features of learning rather than warnings. Hospitals purchased instruments sparingly. Financial constraints encouraged long-term use, despite damage or dulling. Replacing tools required funds unavailable to many institutions. Administrators accepted risks quietly. Surgeons adapted to shortcomings, adjusting pressure or angle during procedures. Metal bent, chipped, or rusted, yet remained functional in the eyes of those using it. Some reformers proposed cleaning improvements, though their voices gained minimal attention. Without a scientific understanding of germs, their recommendations appeared unnecessary. Changing established habits required evidence that did not yet exist. Hospitals continued their daily routines unchanged. Instruments, central to every operation, remained carriers of danger no one recognized. Survivors of operations witnessed the aftermath intimately. They watched bandages soak rapidly with discolored fluids. They felt heat rising from infected wounds spreading through limbs. Nurses attempted to relieve symptoms with warm cloths or poultices. Nothing halted progression once. Contamination penetrated deeply. Patients weakened steadily. Many drifted into delirium before succumbing. Through each operation, contaminated tools shaped outcomes quietly. Surgeons prided themselves on skill, unaware that their instruments carried risks capable of undoing any technical achievement. Hospitals accepted these patterns as natural. Pain, fever, and death appeared inevitable companions of surgery. Metal tools moved through wards, carrying traces no one questioned, weaving harm into bodies already struggling. Quiet obedience reinforced these routines, allowing contamination to settle into daily practice. Broader uncertainty gathered within hospital walls, shaping an atmosphere heavy with sickness. The atmosphere inside Victorian hospitals settled heavily on anyone who entered. Odours formed the first barrier, drifting through corridors with slow persistence. Blood, that had dried hours earlier, mixed with newer spills, still warm from recent procedures. Human waste clung to the corners of wards, where staff lacked time to clean thoroughly. Chemical vapours rose from containers used to mask stronger smells, yet these vapours merged with decay rather than covering it. Nothing resembled freshness. Air thickened until breathing required deliberate effort. Patients lying in beds inhaled this mixture daily. Their chests rose and fell slowly as though their bodies resisted bringing more polluted air inside. Some turned faces toward the walls, hoping to escape, smells creeping across mattresses. Others lay motionless, resigned to whatever drifted through open wounds or cracked lips. Weakness amplified every sensation. The scent of rot intensified nausea. The sharpness of chemicals irritated throats already burning from fever. No relief existed within these walls. Moans filled the wards. They rose from beds, where patients battled pain without assistance from anesthesia or effective medicine. Voices emerged in different tones. Low groans from those tired of struggling, sharp cries from those in sudden agony, murmured pleas from those fading into delirium. These sounds traveled across rows of beds, blending into rhythms nurses learned to ignore. Over time, noise became background hum, constant and unremarkable. Death rarely arrived quietly. Bodies stiffened slowly under thin blankets. Eyes remained half open, reflecting dim lamplight. Limbs froze in unnatural positions, uncorrected by staff, moving quickly between tasks. Deceased patients sometimes remained in beds for hours, waiting for porters to clear space in overcrowded morgues. Other patients watched these scenes unfold with detachment born from exhaustion. Life and death occupied the same room, divided only by thin fabric or wooden frames. Nurses worked through these conditions without hesitation. Their clothing absorbed odors that clung for entire shifts. They moved between beds, carrying cloths, buckets, or instruments, stepping over stains hardened into the floor. Their expressions remained unchanged. Years of exposure dulled sensitivity to decay. New staff struggled at first, covering noses with sleeves or turning away during moments of intense odor, yet endurance grew rapidly. Survival within these walls demanded adaptation. Doctors experienced the environment differently. Their confidence shielded them from discomfort. They entered wards with purpose, focusing on procedures rather than surroundings. Smells did not slow movements. Sounds did not distract. Their minds remained fixed on tasks, examining wounds, discussing symptoms, deciding next steps. Even when stepping over discarded dressings or passing bodies covered loosely by sheets, their posture revealed no hesitation. Visitors entered reluctantly. Many stopped just inside the doorway, overwhelmed by the blend of odor and noise. Some brought handkerchiefs, soaked in scented oils to press against faces. Their eyes scanned dimly lit corners, recognizing shadows shaped like bodies. They listened to cries echoing through the halls, unsure where they originated. Visits remained brief. Staying longer felt unbearable. Once outside, visitors breathed deeply, grateful for air untainted by suffering. Windows offered limited relief. Glass panes trapped moisture and smoke from oil lamps. When opened, they allowed cold drafts to sweep across patients, worsening chills. Staff closed them quickly, preserving warmth at the expense of ventilation. Air grew stale, swirling lazily above beds filled with sickness. Dust floated visibly in sunlight during daytime hours, drifting slowly toward floors already coated with debris. Some patients attempted to cope by covering their faces with cloths. Others pressed noses into sleeves. Those too weak accepted whatever drifted through the room. Each breath brought a mixture of disease, decay, and chemical residue. These inhalations deepened existing illnesses. Wounds are more easily infected. Fevers intensified. Weak lungs collapsed steadily. Many died not from original conditions but from the environment. Overwhelming bodies pushed beyond limits. Carts carrying bodies moved through hallways regularly. Wheels creaked under the weight. Sheet corners brushed floors. Nurses guiding carts did so without ceremony. Patients watched silently, aware their own bodies might follow a similar path. For some, fear surfaced in trembling hands or tightening chests. Others showed no reaction, desensitized by constant exposure to death. The presence of lifeless bodies shaped hospital identity more strongly than any treatment offered. Night brought a heavier atmosphere. Lamps flickered weakly, casting uneven light across walls stained by smoke. Shadows deepened around beds. Sounds sharpened. Coughs cut through silence. Groans grew louder. Footsteps echoed distinctly, revealing movements of nurses passing between patients. Death occurred more often during these hours when fatigue silenced resistance. Bodies cooled quickly. Sheets draped loosely over forms outlined clearly beneath fabric. No swift removal occurred. Nights demanded triage for living first. The idea of hospitals as spaces for healing felt distant. The environment communicated a decline rather than a recovery. Those who entered bore witness to suffering compressed into small rooms, filled with odors too complex to separate. Every sense was activated reluctantly. Touch involved sticky surfaces or damp cloths. Sight revealed bodies fading under dim light. Hearing carried the weight of pain that never paused. Smell overwhelmed thought. Even taste shifted as stale air left bitterness on lips. Through these conditions, hospitals resembled living graveyards. They held bodies waiting for death. Bodies enduring death, bodies recently claimed by death. Staff navigated between stages without an emotional shift. Patients contemplated fate quietly. Visitors stepped lightly, uncertain where safety existed. No wall separated hope from despair. Air carried finality inside it, heavy and unavoidable. Hospital air settled over every patient, turning each moment into a quiet struggle against what drifted unseen. Staff continued routines inside this heaviness, accepting its presence without question. Deeper concerns gathered within treatment rooms, shaped by beliefs mixing superstition with outdated medical theory. Hospitals of the era allowed superstition and outdated medical theory to blend into daily practice without conflict. Doctors moved through wards with confidence, built upon ideas that had survived for centuries, rather than knowledge grounded in observation or experiment. Their certainty shaped every decision. Patients watched quietly, unaware that many treatments placed them at greater risk than the illnesses they carried. Belief acted as a guiding force stronger than evidence or logic. Bloodletting remained one of the most trusted methods. Physicians believed illness formed when blood became stagnant or corrupted. Removing portions of it was considered essential for restoring balance. Bowls filled slowly as veins released steady streams. Patients grew pale within minutes. Some fainted, others trembled violently. The room often grew silent afterward except for shallow breaths, revealing weakness settling deeper into their bodies. Even when fevers worsened or strength vanished entirely, doctors insisted the procedure succeeded because bad blood had been released. Opium offered another common tool. Physicians prescribed it for pain, sleep, or emotional distress. Patients swallowed mixtures freely, unaware of dependency forming within their bodies. Some drifted into long periods of confusion. Others slipped into comas from which they never returned. Its effects dulled suffering temporarily, yet long-term outcomes remained grim. Still, its use continued due to immediate relief visible to doctors who measured success by short-term calm rather than survival. Mercury found a place in treatment as well. Doctors valued its ability to induce strong reactions, sweating, vomiting, or extreme salivation. These reactions were interpreted as signs that illness was leaving the body. Patients endured these effects with limited protest. Teeth loosened, gums bled constantly, stomachs burned, muscles weakened. The toxicity of mercury was not widely recognized, so physicians persisted, convinced that vigorous bodily response signaled positive transformation. Arsenic entered medicine through similar lines of reasoning. Small doses were believed to strengthen vitality or combat infection. Patients ingested powders mixed with bread or dissolved in liquid. Their skin yellowed slowly, limbs grew stiff, weakness spreads through joints. Doctors viewed these changes as natural stages of recovery, rather than warning signs. Treatment continued until bodies reached the point of collapse. Many deaths attributed to disease resulted directly from these substances, administered in good faith. Physicians also relied heavily on spiritual explanations. Illness, in their view, sometimes originated from divine displeasure or malevolent forces. They observed symptoms as messages rather than biological events. Patients experiencing seizures might be labeled as being touched by unseen entities. Those with persistent fevers were deemed caught between realms of spiritual conflict. Treatments in such cases included prayer, ritual cleansing, or isolation intended to expel harmful influences. Scientific inquiry rarely entered discussion. Hospitals allowed priests or spiritual advisors to walk freely among beds. Their presence reassured families but often reinforced outdated beliefs. Patients were instructed to confess fears, sins, or troubling visions. Some found comfort in these interactions. Others grew terrified, believing sickness represented divine punishment. Emotional strain worsened physical decline. Doctors supported these practices because they aligned with a broader worldview, linking morality with health. Medical texts of the period revealed deep contradictions. Some chapters describe traditional cures involving herbs or observation of symptoms. Other sections detailed harmful treatments rooted in superstition. Physicians followed preferred passages, selectively shaped by mentors or personal conviction. Hospitals became places where conflicting theories lived side by side. Consistency did not exist. Treatment differed dramatically from one ward to another, even for identical conditions. Nurses reinforced these beliefs unintentionally. They repeated instructions from physicians without questioning the origins. Many held their own superstitions, shaped by upbringing or local folklore. Some believed moon phases influenced healing. Others trusted charms worn under clothing to protect patients from harm. These ideas merged into routines, performed daily. Actions carried meaning not based on evidence, but on tradition deeply rooted in communities. Patients responded to this environment with mixed emotions. Some trusted doctors completely accepting treatments without hesitation. They hoped procedures would restore strength or remove suffering. Others expressed fear when witnessing the effects of mercury or bloodletting on nearby beds. Whispered conversations circulated quietly between patients, describing deaths that occurred shortly after certain procedures. Still, choices remained limited. Hospitals offered few alternatives, and leaving meant facing illness without support. Families observing treatment often felt powerless. They stood at bedsides watching loved ones weaken under therapies meant to heal. Many hesitated to challenge physicians, believing expertise rested solely in professional hands. Questions formed silently, but rarely reached spoken form. Acceptance dominated interactions, shaped by social expectation rather than confidence in results. Doctors hardly considered outcomes, failures. When patients died, deaths were attributed to the overwhelming disease rather than the methods employed. Case notes described conditions as incurable or advanced beyond saving. Few connected outcomes with treatments administered hours earlier. This pattern allowed harmful practices to persist for decades. Without questioning their own methods, doctors saw no reason to change. Hospitals remained places where superstition and outdated theory shaped every decision. Illness moved through wards guided by beliefs carried from generation to generation. Evidence had little influence. Patients entered seeking recovery, yet faced treatments rooted in a misunderstanding of the body. Air thickened with uncertainty as rituals of medicine blended seamlessly with rituals of faith. Nothing separated one from the other. Both guided hands that worked upon fragile bodies. Old beliefs tightened their grip on treatment, turning each remedy into a quiet risk that patients rarely understood. Shadows of fear lingered in every ward, where superstition guided choices more than knowledge. Behind those shadows waited a harsher divide, one built from wealth, distance, privilege, and the quiet suffering of those left with nothing else. Walking into a Victorian hospital meant stepping into a world arranged by wealth, a world where comfort narrowed itself around those who could afford it. The hierarchy appeared in the smallest gestures: how a door was opened, how a doctor slowed his step, how a patient's name was spoken. Those with status were ushered toward private rooms, where bedding was replaced more often, windows cracked open for fresher air, and physicians behaved as though suffering deserved gentleness. Illness did not disappear, but its edges softened. For the poor, the picture shifted sharply. They were taken to vast public wards, where beds served more as boundaries than spaces of rest. 5, sometimes 10 people occupied a single mattress, arranged tightly like cargo, each body touching or pressing the next. A new arrival simply slid into whatever spot remained. The smell of sweat, old linen, and infection clung to everything. Groans layered over whispers, and the dim light did nothing to hide how quickly hope thinned in such a place. The contrast between the two areas felt almost deliberate. In private rooms, silence moved slowly, broken only by a doctor's calm voice or the soft clatter of a clean basin. Floors were still dirty by modern standards, yet noticeably clearer. The sense of being looked after, even imperfectly, gave the illusion of safety. Meanwhile, in the public wards, air hung thick with heat, sickness, and exhaustion. Windows stayed shut to keep out drafts, trapping every cough, every fevered breath, every scent rising from unwashed wounds. Doctors themselves behaved differently, depending on which side of the hospital they occupied. In wealthy quarters, they paused at the bedside, asked questions, listened for details. In the common wards, their visits were short, mechanical, often reduced to a glance, a brief touch of a wrist, a nod, a muttered instruction to a nurse. Illness became something observed from a distance rather than treated with intent. The poor learned quickly the less they asked, the less they were seen as trouble. Visitors noticed the divide even more painfully. Families of the affluent could sit beside their loved ones, bring warm food, and share quiet conversations. In the crowded wards, visitors stood awkwardly between beds, trying not to step on discarded cloths or touch another patient's arm. The noise overwhelmed everything. A baby crying, an old man muttering through fever, the wheezing breaths of someone refusing to give up. Many visitors left with the same expression, a kind of silent grief mixed with resignation. The system ensured that options remained unequal. Wealthy patients could reject treatments or ask for second opinions. They could summon outside help. Poor patients received whatever was available without explanation and without choice. Their food came in thin bowls, their bandages reused, their bodies lifted and turned by hands moving too quickly to show care. Consent was a luxury they were never offered. Statistics of the era, though incomplete, hinted at the consequences. Higher survival rates clustered around those with money, not because they received better medicine, but because they avoided the additional dangers built into the wards for the poor. Infection spread faster where beds were shared. Airborne diseases traveled easily through the tight rows. Sheets rarely washed carried the imprint of past patients. Even the walls became silent, participants in the cycle of sickness, absorbing what floated through the room and returning it again. Stories circulated quietly. A wealthy merchant's child walked out weeks later, pale but alive. A labourer's son, admitted the same day, died within 3 nights. A woman with means delivered her baby under attentive supervision. A seamstress laboured in the noisy ward and never rose again. These were not exceptions, they were patterns. Hospitals did not pretend to hide them. Everyone knew, yet nothing changed. Walking deeper into such a building, one felt the weight of separation intensify. The corridors leading to the affluent rooms smelled slightly cleaner, lit by steadier lamps. The wards for the poor felt darker, colder in some corners, and unbearably hot in others. Every sight, every sound, every step reinforced the same truth: care was not a universal right. It was a privilege handed only to those whose lives were considered worth saving. The poorest patients understood this without needing to hear it spoken. They lay still, not only from weakness but from fear. Fear of being seen as troublesome. Fear of losing what little space they had. Fear of becoming invisible altogether. Some whispered prayers. Others stared at the ceiling, waiting for a moment, when the air shifted, signalling a nurse passing by. Days stretched long in that waiting. Hospitals during this era did not simply treat illness. They reflected society's structure with cold accuracy. Health followed status. Survival followed money. Suffering deepened for those already at the bottom. And through it all, the institution maintained the appearance of charity, while functioning more like a sorting ground, dividing lives into those worth effort and those expected to fade quietly. Privilege dictated whether illness came with dignity or with despair. Rooms opened gently for some, while doors stayed closed for others. Far beyond those closed doors, a single figure would eventually rise to challenge what the system accepted without question. Stepping into a Victorian hospital meant entering a structure that had grown accustomed to failure. Yet within that structure, a single woman began altering currents that had held firm for decades. Florence Nightingale did not walk through those wards with theatrical conviction. She observed, quietly recorded tirelessly, and moved with a steadiness that unsettled those who believed the system could never change. Her presence formed a contrast to the dim corridors. She studied corridors shaped by routine rather than intention. She noticed details that others ignored. Basins left unwashed. Towels are used repeatedly without thought. Heaps of cloth piled in corners holding moisture and illness. Patients lay in rows close enough for fevered breaths to drift freely from one face to the next. These conditions did not shock her. They confirmed what she already suspected: hospitals served as gathering places for sickness, not as sanctuaries for healing. She began writing her observations in notebooks, each line steady, each number placed with purpose. Her insistence on data separated her from her contemporaries. While many physicians argued from habit or pride, she counted bodies. She tracked death rates by ward, by season, by circumstance, and found patterns hidden from those unwilling to confront the truth. Where others saw misfortune, she identified preventable outcomes. She understood that cleanliness, something so simple, so basic, held more power than most treatments of the time. Her advocacy for washing hands appeared almost trivial to those around her. Doctors dismissed it as unnecessary, fussing nurses, as an inconvenience that slowed their work. Yet she persisted, showing through numbers that mortality dropped when water, soap, and discipline shaped daily routines. Her suggestions extended further: fresh air organized, waste removal, separated wards, and patient classification. Each improvement aimed not at perfection, but at reducing harm. Resistance followed her everywhere. Some authorities accused her of exaggeration. Others saw her as a threat to established hierarchies. Her work challenged not only hospital habits, but the pride of men who feared exposure of their ignorance. Many believed that death simply accompanied illness, and that intervention mattered little. She disagreed quietly, but firmly refusing to let the weight of tradition silence what her evidence clearly revealed. The Crimean War hardened her resolve. There she witnessed overcrowded tents where soldiers lay in filth wounds, uncleaned water fouled, and death accepted without urgency. She moved through the chaos with the same steady step she carried in civilian hospitals, directing nurses, establishing washing routines, and demanding basic order. Her reforms lowered mortality in ratios that seemed impossible to those watching. She never claimed heroism. She recorded results and allowed the numbers to speak. Returning to Britain, she faced a different challenge, transforming a system comfortable with decay. She published her findings in reports shaped by statistical diagrams, making the truth visible even to those who preferred ignorance. The diagrams revealed sharp rises in deaths when sanitation collapsed, and equally sharp declines when reforms took hold. Her clarity embarrassed institutions that had long deflected accountability. Despite her influence, change spread slowly. Hospitals clung to their habits, doctors resisted oversight, and funding rarely matched the scale of the problem. The public, accustomed to thinking of hospitals as grim necessities rather than reliable refuges, moved hesitantly toward acceptance of new standards. Nightingale understood that transformation required persistence rather than triumph. She continued writing, instructing, and shaping training programs for nurses who carried her principles into the future. The nurses she trained differed from those previously found in hospital corridors. They learned structure, hygiene, responsibility, and record-keeping. They became essential components of patient care, not secondary attendants. Their presence began altering the rhythm of hospital life. Beds gained order, linen changed more often, waste moved out rather than collecting in corners. These improvements grew gradually, sometimes uncertainly, but they formed the early outline of modern medicine. Nightingale herself carried a quiet severity. Her work aged her quickly, confining her for long periods due to illness, yet she never abandoned her mission. She wrote letters from her room, trained staff from afar, and continued shaping public health policies. Her voice, though contained within walls, reached Parliament, governments, and medical institutions resistant to scrutiny. Change did not erupt, but drifted steadily outward, reshaping expectations. Her presence illuminated something beyond procedure: the moral responsibility of care. She demonstrated that hospitals must not simply accept suffering as fate, they must act against it. Her reforms brought dignity to the idea of treatment, pushing the institution toward its purpose rather than its habit. Though decades passed before her principles were fully integrated into hospital systems, the foundation she established remained firm. Walking through a hospital in the later Victorian years, one could sense the shift she initiated. Floors held less grime, air moved a little cleaner, and water circulated with intention rather than convenience. These changes did not erase danger, but they reduced unnecessary death. Her impact emerged not as spectacle, but as a gradual reduction of harm, a quiet alteration of the environment in which illness unfolded. Her legacy lives through numbers that once shocked a complacent society. She proved that survival did not belong to chance. It belonged to systems shaped with precision care and accountability. She offered a new path in a landscape that had long surrendered to despair. Her findings reshaped how illness was understood, revealing that care required structure rather than superstition. Each observation she recorded chipped away at long-standing complacency. Tension grew quietly within hospitals as her influence expanded, preparing the ground for deeper confrontations with practices yet to be exposed. Walking into a Victorian asylum meant entering a world where the boundaries between treatment and punishment dissolved quietly. The building often stood apart from the rest of the town, heavy stone walls rising with no invitation. Inside, the halls carried a different rhythm than the hospitals where illness was visible. Here, suffering moved without a clear pattern, drifting from room to room in voices that rose and fell without warning. The institution was meant to protect the public from those labelled unstable. Yet its practices revealed something harsher. It protected itself from accountability. Patients arrived with no distinction between their conditions. Melancholy stood beside delusion. Grief shared a corridor with epilepsy. Those overwhelmed by poverty or exhaustion lived beside those experiencing violent hallucinations. No real effort existed to understand the differences. Diagnosis became a single blanket word: madness, and treatment reflected that absence of nuance. Each person was reduced to a problem requiring confinement rather than care. Restraints dominated the landscape. Leather straps took the place of conversation, holding bodies motionless for hours or days. Iron bars locked wrists and ankles in positions that denied comfort. Some patients lay on straw mats without blankets, their limbs stiff from cold and immobility. Staff believed stillness kept danger away, yet the stillness broke many who entered, with minds fragile but not shattered. The institution rarely questioned whether restraint itself caused further damage. Electric shocks emerged as another method masked as therapy. The equipment looked crude: metal coils connected to hand-cranked devices that produced unpredictable currents. Patients trembled violently, while attendants watched with detached familiarity. Records described these procedures as attempts to reset disordered nerves, though no evidence existed to support the theory. The shocks often left individuals weaker, confused, or permanently injured. The line between cruelty and cure blurred until it vanished altogether. Food offered little relief. Meals arrived irregularly, often consisting of thin broth or stale bread. Those labelled uncooperative received less. Some went hungry for days, their bodies shrinking as attendants justified starvation as discipline. Hydration followed similar patterns. Water came in cups that tasted of metal and mildew, passed impatiently from hand to hand. The institution claimed such measures maintained order. In truth, they exposed the fragility of those trapped within its walls. Women suffered a separate form of misjudgment. Many were admitted for reasons unrelated to mental illness, refusing an arranged marriage, speaking too boldly in public, or expressing grief that persisted longer than society deemed acceptable. The word hysteria justified their confinement. Once labelled, they lost authority over their own bodies. Their protests became proof of their condition, creating a cycle with no escape. Some remained in the asylum for the rest of their lives, forgotten by the families who placed them there. The atmosphere carried constant noise, cries rising through corridors, footsteps echoing against stone, occasional laughter that held no joy. Staff moved with routine indifference, guiding patients through motions that resembled chores more than care. Washing occurred rarely. Bedding remained unchanged until filth made the neglect undeniable. The air thickened with odors, sweat waste, damp straw, unwashed skin. No effort was made to create dignity. Survival existed moment to moment. Visitors rarely entered. Families delivered relatives to the asylum and returned to their own lives, relieved to hand responsibility to an institution that promised management. They seldom questioned what happened inside. The building stood as proof that society addressed mental illness, even if the solutions resembled containment more than treatment. Outsiders preferred not to imagine the details. Records kept by administrators told their version of events. They described patient improvement in vague terms, emphasizing discipline over healing. Punishments appeared briefly or not at all. Many deaths were attributed to natural causes despite injuries suggesting otherwise. The institution justified its methods as necessary for safety, though safety often meant convenience for the staff rather than protection for the patients. Some attendants behaved with quiet sympathy, offering small comforts where possible. A blanket straightened a cup, lifted gently to someone's lips. A door left slightly open for a breeze. These gestures mattered, but they could not overcome the larger structure surrounding them. The asylum operated as a machine built to suppress individuality. Care became an afterthought in the face of procedures designed to maintain order. The system endured because few challenged it. Mental illness carried a stigma that silenced those outside its walls. The public accepted confinement as a solution, believing it kept danger away from the streets. They did not see the injuries hidden beneath bandages, or the despair in eyes that once held clarity. They did not hear the nighttime cries that dissolved into exhaustion, only to begin again the following day. Walking through the asylum left an impression deeper than the walls themselves. It revealed how institutions built under the banner of protection could transform into territories of quiet violence. It showed how suffering expanded when misunderstanding shaped every decision. It demonstrated how patients stripped of identity lost their place in the world long before illness claimed them. The asylum exposed the limits of what society was willing to confront, leaving those within its walls trapped between fear and neglect. Each decision taken by the staff reinforced patterns that harmed rather than healed. In corners where silence settled heavily, something waited to expose how authority twisted itself into cruelty. Entering a Victorian hospital meant stepping into a place where endings unfolded quietly, often unnoticed by the world outside. Death threaded itself through the wards, as naturally as the draft slipping under the doors. Yet what defined these endings was not simply illness, it was solitude. Patients reached their final moments without familiar voices, without hands they recognized, without the comfort of presence that might have softened the passage. Visiting hours restricted any possibility of companionship. Families arrived only during set times, standing briefly beside beds arranged in long rows. Conversations remained, rushed, shaped by anxiety rather than warmth, because attendants hovered nearby, waiting for permission to resume their routines. Once the allotted minutes expired, families disappeared down the corridor, regardless of the patient's condition. If a decline happened outside those narrow windows, no one called them back. In these dim wards, many sensed the nearness of their own ending. Some tried to stay awake during visiting hours, fighting exhaustion, so they could look once more at someone who cared for them. Others slipped into a state where awareness faded, neither fully conscious nor entirely gone. The noise of the ward coughs, murmurs, and shifting sheets continued around them, indifferent to their struggle. Death rarely carried drama. It simply arrived when the body surrendered. Nurses observed these moments with practiced calm. With so many patients requiring attention, they responded to each passing with efficiency rather than emotion. A body that grew still received a brief inspection, a note, sometimes a quiet nod. Physicians followed with signatures on documents, summarizing the end in a single line. The routine reduced deaths due to administration. Removal followed almost immediately. Orderlies arrived with stretchers wrapping bodies in cloth with motions that suggested repetition rather than reverence. The deceased moved through the corridor without ceremony toward the morgue. Beds were prepared for new patients within minutes. A fresh sheet might be added, but the room still held remnants of the life that had just left a faint indent on the pillow. The smell of breath that would not return, the quiet that felt heavier than before. Relatives learned of the death later, often long after the body had already been relocated. Some arrived expecting to sit with their loved one, hoping to whisper something in a quiet room. Instead, they were directed to an office, handed brief explanations, and dismissed with instructions regarding the morgue. Their grief unfolded under harsh lighting, surrounded by strangers offering no space for reflection. Inside the morgue, the environment resembled storage more than a sanctuary. Bodies lay on cold slabs, arranged according to convenience. Tags hung loosely from wrists. The air carried a mixture of chemical preservative and damp stone. No prayers, no pauses, no softness filled the room. Workers moved quickly, preparing for the steady flow of patients the hospital could not save. The situation became even bleaker for those who died without families. Many among the poor had no relatives able or willing to visit, and their deaths passed with no witnesses. Administrators recorded them with minimal detail, occupation, age, cause when known, before transferring them to communal graves or research tables. These individuals disappeared into institutional silence, leaving no trace beyond a line in a ledger. Patients who survived saw these routines repeatedly. They noticed when a curtain remained drawn too long. They recognized the sound of a stretcher entering the ward. They watched as a bed emptied and filled again before anyone had time to acknowledge the person who had occupied it. Fear grew quietly among them. Not only fear of illness, but fear of dying unseen. Recovery rooms offered little comfort. Beds sat only steps away from the spaces where death had occurred hours earlier. The boundaries between living and dying blurred. Patients did not speak openly about it, yet the awareness lingered in their eyes. Some avoided looking at stretchers passing. Others stared, absorbing every detail, as though preparing themselves for an unavoidable possibility. The hospital enforced its rules with unwavering rigidity. Even those who begged to stay with a dying relative were turned away once visiting hours ended. The institution valued order above compassion. Staff reassured themselves that consistency kept chaos at bay. But for the dying, these rules stripped away the one thing illness had not already taken: connection to those they loved. Time inside the hospital moved uneasily. Days stretched long in dim light. Nights filled with restless noises. Some patients died, quietly slipping away unnoticed until the morning inspection. Others struggled in silence, their breaths uneven, their bodies growing colder, while the ward continued its steady rhythm. The hospital absorbed each death without pause. Families who arrived too late carried a grief sharpened by the knowledge that their loved ones died alone. Some touched the empty bed where the patient had lain, searching for traces of warmth. Others stood in hallways stunned, replaying the last short visit that had ended sooner than they wished. The institution offered little comfort. It prioritized space, routine, and efficiency. Death inside these hospitals reflected more than medical limits. It revealed how easily human connection vanished in a system designed to move bodies rather than support lives. It exposed the emotional void created when structure outweighed compassion. It demonstrated that even in illness, moral weight belonged not only to treatment, but to presence, something the institution rarely allowed. Isolation shaped the final moments of countless patients, turning death into something quieter yet heavier. Routines continued untouched despite each loss. Somewhere within those routines, a different force waited, one shaped by authority drifting further from care. Within Victorian hospitals, authority was collected around physicians in ways that shaped every corner of the building. Their presence carried an unspoken weight felt even before they entered a ward. Conversations quieted attendants, straightened their posture, and nurses stepped aside, as though clearing a path for someone whose decisions held finality. The atmosphere itself seemed to rearrange around them. Patients watched carefully, fearing both attention and neglect, unsure which posed greater risk. No one questioned their decisions. A doctor's word functioned as a decree, not a suggestion. When they issued orders, the staff moved instantly, regardless of doubt or worry. Nurses who suspected an instruction might harm a patient kept their thoughts hidden. To speak against a physician risked dismissal, humiliation, or worse. Silence became a form of survival both for nurses and for patients whose conditions left them too weak to protest. Physicians acted with confidence that appeared natural within this hierarchy. They moved from bed to bed with a sense of ownership, touching bodies, lifting limbs, pressing wounds, sometimes speaking aloud their assumptions, but more often remaining silent. Their gestures communicated control more clearly than words. Patients lay still, trying not to anger or inconvenience those who held their fate. This sense of absolute authority extended into experimentation. Hospitals provided fertile ground for trials that blurred the distinction between treatment and risk. Doctors introduced new techniques without explanation, relying on their status to shield them from scrutiny. A patient might be administered unfamiliar substances, subjected to sudden incisions, or left in conditions meant to test resilience. No record required consent. Consent in truth barely existed as a concept. The outcomes varied widely because skill levels differed dramatically among physicians. Some possessed steady hands and thoughtful judgment, while others misread symptoms, misapplied procedures, or misinterpreted signs of deterioration. Yet the system offered no oversight. A brilliant doctor and an incompetent one stood side by side with equal authority. Patients had no way to distinguish between them. Their lives depended on chance disguised as expertise. Failures rarely resulted in correction. When a treatment went wrong, physicians attributed the outcome to the illness, the patient's weakness, or unfortunate timing. Records reflected these explanations with clinical detachment. Staff whispered privately but never challenged official conclusions. Even when patterns emerged, several deaths under the care of a single doctor, institutions preferred silence over confrontation. Removing a physician risked acknowledging that the system itself was flawed. Doctors also controlled access to information. They decided which symptoms mattered, which histories remained relevant, and which warnings deserved attention. Patients received instructions without context, leaving them confused about their own conditions. Some clung to hope simply because a physician spoke to them with certainty. Others sensed danger, but lacked the words or authority to resist. The imbalance remained constant, heavy, and unyielding. During rounds, doctors traveled in small groups accompanied by trainees eager to imitate their demeanor. The trainees repeated phrases, nodded at explanations, and absorbed the culture of unquestioned authority. They learned early that confidence mattered more than accuracy, decisiveness more than humility. In this environment, the hospital reproduced its own hierarchy, generation after generation. Occasionally, a patient attempted to challenge a doctor's command. Such attempts rarely succeeded. Staff reminded them that resistance delayed treatment. Physicians dismissed concerns as irrational or obstructive. Those who questioned too strongly risked being labeled difficult, uncooperative, or unstable labels that justified even harsher interventions. Patients quickly realized that compliance offered the safest path, however uncertain its destination. Doctors also determined which patients received attention. Those considered promising or interesting cases attracted more visits. Those believed hopeless received only glances. Treatment depended not solely on illness, but on the physician's curiosity, fatigue, or mood. Beds at the far ends of wards, where light dimmed and drafts gathered, often housed patients whose conditions deteriorated quietly unnoticed until it was too late. Even nurses who cared deeply for their patients found themselves constrained. They monitored symptoms, administered basic care, and cleaned wounds, yet any significant decision rested with physicians. They could not order tests, adjust treatment, or refuse harmful instructions. Their knowledge grew through experience, but the structure dismissed it as secondary. They saw mistakes, endured guilt, and continued because they had no power to intervene. This environment created an illusion of order, masking layers of uncertainty. Physicians projected authority while navigating incomplete knowledge. They worked without modern diagnostics, without reliable sanitation, without antibiotics. Many acted from habit rather than science. Yet, their authority shielded them from accountability. Their role resembled rulership more than medical stewardship, and the hospital functioned like a territory governed by individuals rather than principles. Patients sensed this imbalance deeply. Some stared at the ceiling when a doctor approached, afraid of contact. Others followed every motion with anxious eyes, searching for meaning in gestures they did not understand. A few prayed quietly, hoping the doctor assigned to them possessed skill rather than arrogance. They lived in a system where survival depended not only on illness, but on the judgment of a single individual. Hospitals tolerated this structure because it maintained efficiency. A strong hierarchy kept routines predictable. Institutions believed that questioning a doctor weakened discipline. Yet this reliance on authority concealed danger. Decisions made without oversight accumulated consequences. Behind closed doors, physicians shaped fates with tools that cut, pierced, and altered bodies with only their own reasoning as a guide. What emerged from these practices was a portrait of power left unchecked. Doctors held more influence over life and death than nearly any figure outside the courtroom. Their decisions touched every aspect of patient experience, treatment, suffering, comfort, and outcome. In a setting already marked by infection, overcrowding, and inadequate resources, this authority created risks far greater than illness alone. Authority concentrated within a single role produced outcomes shaped by judgment rather than deliberate oversight. Patients lived under decisions delivered without pause for doubt. Within those decisions, deeper currents began gathering, ready to expose how power could drift into territory few wanted to acknowledge. Stepping closer to the core of Victorian medical institutions meant confronting a truth that many preferred not to acknowledge. Hospitals often functioned less as places of healing and more as spaces designed to conceal those who no longer fit within the flow of daily life. Illness, poverty, physical weakness, and mental instability, these conditions unsettled the ideals of progress that society projected. By placing such individuals within hospital walls, the public maintained the illusion of order while distancing itself from discomfort it did not wish to face. The wards were filled with people whose lives had drifted from productivity. Workers injured in factories, women weakened by childbirth, elderly individuals with no families, children with chronic illness, all were placed in beds that served more as containers than sources of recovery. The hospital recorded their presence in ledgers, but these records acted more like inventory lists than medical histories. Patients became entries to be managed, not individuals to be restored. Doctors rarely acknowledged this underlying purpose. They moved through the wards with practiced authority, issuing instructions that gave the appearance of medical precision. Yet their actions often mirrored the institution's priorities, maintaining order, clearing space, reducing burdens. Those considered unlikely to recover received minimal attention. Time and resources flowed toward cases that provided professional interest or visible improvement, leaving many to fade quietly. The buildings themselves reinforced this dynamic. Windows remained closed to prevent drafts dimming natural light. Corridors stretched long and narrow, their floors worn by years of hurried footsteps. Wards arranged in tight rows transformed bodies into units, each bed another reminder of the system's true function. The architecture supported surveillance more than comfort. Movement could be observed, disruptions noticed quickly, and containment maintained. Society's expectations contributed to the problem. People believed hospitals protected the community by removing individuals who might contaminate workplaces, neighborhoods, or public spaces. This belief combined fear with convenience. The sick disappeared into institutions, relieving families and employers of responsibility. Once inside, patients rarely returned until they were either improved enough to re-enter society or weakened beyond hope. For many, admission felt like the first step toward erasure. Their voices grew faint in rooms dominated by routine. Staff referred to them by bed number rather than name. Personal possessions were removed, stored, or discarded. Days passed with little variation, punctuated only by rounds, meals, or the occasional visit. Even these visits diminished as weeks went by until families stopped coming altogether. Patients remained not because they were healing, but because the institution required them to stay. In moments of clarity, some understood the reality. They sensed that society valued efficiency more than their survival. They recognized the subtle shift in how staff treated them. The lowered tone of voice, the avoidance of eye contact, They felt themselves becoming invisible. Illness isolated them physically. The hospital completed the emotional isolation by absorbing them into its structure. Overcrowding intensified this sense of abandonment. Beds lined hallways when wards filled beyond capacity. Patients lay beside supply rooms or beneath flickering lamps, listening to the distant hum of activity while receiving little direct attention. Administrators justified this expansion as a necessity. Yet, necessity revealed the institution's true purpose, keeping the sick out of public view, no matter how inadequate the conditions inside became. Within these walls, treatment often resembled containment. Weak individuals received little more than basic sustenance. Some endured days without conversation. Others watched as new arrivals replaced those who died overnight. Deaths were reported briefly before stretchers carried bodies away. The hospital operated as though its primary duty was to maintain the flow of patients in and out, rather than ensuring anyone recovered. The poorer the patient, the more stark the experience. Those without means were placed in wards that bore the heaviest signs of neglect: peeling paint, stained bedding, uneven floors. Charitable intentions masked structural indifference. Donations provided temporary improvements, but systemic change never followed. Patients remained at the mercy of routines that prioritized the stability of the institution above the needs of those inside it. Even the act of diagnosis reflected these priorities. Physicians labeled patients using terms that justified confinement, incurable, non-responsive, and chronic weakness. These labels rarely changed, regardless of actual progress. By defining patients through their limitations, hospitals ensured that their presence seemed appropriate. Society, reading these labels in reports or newspapers, accepted them without question. The irony lay in the language surrounding hospitals. Public discourse described them as places of mercy and advancement, yet the interiors contradicted these ideals. Healing required time, attention, and respect resources the institution distributed selectively. For many, the hospital represented the final stop in a system that sorted people based on their usefulness. Once admitted, they became part of a hidden population, present but unseen. Those who recovered did so despite the environment, rather than because of it. They left with memories of dim light, whispered suffering, and the unmistakable sense that their survival depended on forces beyond medical skill. Those who did not recover became part of the institution's quiet record, their names entering ledgers as soon as their beds emptied. Hospitals during this era revealed society's discomfort with vulnerability. Illness disrupted productivity. Weakness challenged the image of progress. Poverty threatened stability. Rather than confronting these realities, society concealed them in structures called hospitals, allowing the public to believe that care existed even when care remained incomplete. What remained unmistakable to anyone observing closely was not the presence of healing, but the absence of accountability. Patients existed within boundaries, shaped by convenience rather than compassion. Their suffering did not reach beyond the walls. Their disappearance from daily life made society feel safer, without requiring it to understand or address the deeper causes of illness. Hospitals absorbed those deemed inconvenient to the city outside, turning treatment into containment. Routines masked neglect while lives receded into wards built to quiet their presence. From that quiet, deeper contradictions began forming, waiting for the moment they would no longer remain hidden. In Victorian hospitals, even the smallest wound carried potential ruin. A shallow cut from factory metal, a scrape from a fall on cobblestone, a blister opened by worn shoes. Each injury entered a world where infection spread faster than understanding. The hospital received these wounds with the same indifference it offered. More severe cases, yet the danger lay not in the size of the injury, but in the invisible forces that waited inside every ward. Antibiotics did not exist. Physicians knew nothing of the organisms that multiplied quietly beneath damaged skin. They recognized only the visible signs: swelling that thickened the limb, heat spreading across flesh streaks darkening toward the chest. Patients felt pain sharpen throb, then expand into a fever that left them weak. The hospital observed these transformations often enough to consider them routine. No one questioned why a graze could destroy a life. The wards themselves accelerated the process. Air heavy with moisture carried the scent of stale linens, damp floors, and open wounds. Beds crowded together allowed infections to drift from person to person. The instruments used to clean injuries rarely met water, let alone disinfectant. Cloths were wiped multiple wounds without being replaced. Attendants hurrying between beds carried contamination on their hands without knowing it. The environment shaped outcomes more than any treatment available. Patients admitted with minor injuries usually believed they would recover quickly. They entered the ward expecting discomfort, not catastrophe. Early symptoms appeared subtle, a slight hardening around the wound tenderness that persisted through the night. By morning, the flesh reddened. By evening, it pulsed visibly beneath the skin. Nurses applied poultices or compresses, hoping to draw out the infection. The smell that followed, sharp, sour, unmistakable, signaled that the body was losing ground. As the infection deepened, pus collected beneath layers of tissue. Pressure forced it outward, sometimes rupturing through the skin, sometimes devouring the muscle. Surgeons approached these cases with crude tools, scraping away infected flesh, using knives dulled by repeated use. Patients endured the procedures conscious, gripping the edges of the bed as pain shot through them. The removal rarely captured everything. Remnants of infection hid within folds the surgeon could not see. Necrosis followed in patches. Flesh turned from red to purple, then to shades of black that signaled tissue death. The stench thickened around the bed. Flies gathered. Fever burned steadily, draining strength until the patient drifted between restless dreams and harsh wakefulness. Surgeons reached a familiar conclusion. Amputation offered the only chance at survival. Families often resisted, but hesitation allowed infection to spread further, reducing the already slim possibility of living. Amputation unfolded quickly. Patients were restrained, the limb secured, and the saw positioned. In a matter of minutes, the bones separated, and the blood spilled across the floor beneath the table. Assistants worked to cauterize or bind the wound, though contaminants already clung to the instruments. Many patients died the same night, their bodies unable to manage the shock. Those who survived faced a different threat: infection returning through the surgical wound. Chance decided outcomes more than skill. Surgeons varied widely in their abilities. Some cut with precision, leaving relatively clean wounds. Others sawed unevenly, tearing tissue. Without true antiseptic methods, even the most talented surgeon fought against overwhelming odds. Patients who lived did so because their bodies resisted in ways doctors could not predict. Families described these survivals as miracles, though they reflected luck rather than medical triumph. Those who succumbed did so gradually. Their breaths slowed, becoming shallow. Their skin cooled despite lingering fever. Eyes dulled. Nurses recognized the pattern and prepared for the end. Relatives arriving during visiting hours found their loved ones fading, unable to speak or lift their heads. Once death arrived, attendants removed the body with familiar efficiency, leaving the bed ready for someone else whose wound might follow the same trajectory. The staff grew desensitized to these losses. They treated each case as one more inevitable outcome in a system that could not outrun infection. Their resignation formed a quiet acceptance. Small wounds could kill, and nothing existed to stop them. The hospital continued receiving new cases daily, filling rows with individuals who never imagined that a trivial injury could erase their lives. Beyond the hospital walls, fear spread quietly. Workers wrapped minor cuts with cloth soaked in spirits, hoping to stave off swelling. Parents inspected their children's scrapes with worry. But when infections began, the hospital remained their only recourse. Entering the building meant entering a gamble weighted heavily against them. Even those who survived lost pieces of themselves, limbs, strength, and livelihood. Amputees returned to their homes, unable to work, burdened by pain that lingered for months or years. Families adjusted their lives to accommodate the survivors' new limitations. The wound healed, yet its consequences did not. Victorian hospitals revealed a world where medicine could observe but not intervene effectively. Small injuries evolved into fatal threats, not because they were inherently severe, but because the environment offered them room to flourish. The institution witnessed each decline with familiarity, unable to alter the path it watched unfold countless times. What emerged from these cases was not merely tragedy, but a recognition of vulnerability stripped bare. Bodies that endured work, cold, hunger, and exhaustion faltered before infections no one understood. The limits of the era's knowledge displayed themselves clearly as wounds transformed into final sentences. Minor injuries often grew into crises that overtook every effort to contain them. The hospital remained a place where hope thinned as infection expanded unchecked. Through those patterns, something darker began revealing itself, hinting at the final truths the institution could no longer avoid. A hospital in Victorian times was rarely a place people entered willingly. By the time someone crossed its threshold, They already understood that every bed carried a story no one wanted to inherit. The building itself had a way of swallowing hope, leaving only the slow and steady realization that suffering was not a temporary visitor, but a permanent resident. Here, death did not arrive suddenly. It settled quietly like dust finding its way into every corner. People learned to recognize the pace of decline, the way a breath grew shallow, the way a fever lingered with no sign of retreat, the way silence replaced voices that had been present only hours before. Inside these walls, a bed was not the beginning of treatment. It was the beginning of the end. A patient could feel it the moment they lay down the sheets, cold, stiff, and often stained, despite hurried attempts to make them seem clean. The mattress sank under the weight of countless bodies that had occupied it before. Some had recovered briefly only to relapse and die days later. Others had never risen from it at all. Those memories lingered in the air, though no one spoke of them directly. Instead, they appeared in small details: the nurse avoiding eye contact, the doctor turning too quickly from a question, the orderly pushing a stretcher away with practiced movements that revealed routine familiarity with loss. A minor injury could escalate in ways no one predicted. A scraped shin became a swollen leg. A shallow cut became a tunnel of rotting flesh. What began as a simple fever spiraled into delirium, then stillness. Medicine was uncertain, and trust was fragile. Patients often watched each other deteriorate, each death marking another step toward their own dread. The whispers carried between beds were not the hopeful exchanges of people expecting recovery. They were confessions, regrets, last thoughts, spoken softly enough to avoid drawing attention from staff who had no time, or sometimes no willingness to listen. Every injection carries risk. The syringe had been used before, washed quickly if at all, and the needle dulled from previous bodies. A sharp sting was not the worst part. It was the knowledge that whatever entered the bloodstream might help or might hasten the end. There were no guarantees. There were no reassurances. The doctor delivered treatments with a confidence that bordered on ritual, but patients knew that confidence came from repetition, not certainty. A single puncture could mean life, or it could mean the slow fading of breath over the next several days. Cuts were common either from surgery or from smaller interventions intended to release illness from the body. A wound that seemed manageable at first often became a source of dread. Without antiseptics, without the understanding of bacteria, the body became a battlefield, losing ground with every passing hour. Redness crept outward, pain sharpened, pus collected beneath the skin. Patients felt the progression long before anyone acknowledged it. And in many cases, it was only when the smell of decay became noticeable that the doctor finally accepted the truth. The infection had already won. Those who lay in the hospital at night understood something deeper, something that daylight disguised. When the lamps dimmed and the hallways quieted, the building felt less like a place of care and more like a corridor between two worlds. The rustle of sheets carried a tremor of fear. The shifting breaths of patients echoed through the room like uneven steps on a staircase leading downward. And in the silence between those breaths, there was something else, something faint, something almost human, yet not quite. A subtle murmur, a soft tremor of voices that seemed to drift from unseen corners. There were no cries in these hospitals, not after dark. Crying took strength, and strength faded quickly here. What remained were whispers, tired, fragile, and nearly broken. Some whispered to themselves, trying to remember the warmth of home. Some whispered prayers they barely believed. Others whispered for forgiveness or for someone who wasn't there. These whispers filled the space more completely than any sound could. They became the texture of the night, the soft hum of lives teetering between fading and holding on. A patient who listened carefully could map the room by its whispers. The young man near the far window was muttering through fever. The elderly woman was talking to a child who wasn't there. The mother whose breaths grew uneven, each one a quiet plea for one more morning. And sometimes a whisper would cease suddenly. The silence left behind felt heavier than a scream. Staff would come later, lifting the body with practiced solemnity, carrying it away through the narrow corridor. They moved quietly out of habit or respect, or perhaps because noise felt inappropriate in a place where death was not an intruder but a companion. Even those who survived did not leave unchanged. The hospital imprinted itself on memory, its smells, its stillness, its unspoken dread. People who walked out carried invisible marks, the knowledge of how close they had come, the awareness of how quickly life had tilted toward darkness, the unsettling truth that survival was often less about treatment than luck. Now, As this final part draws to a close, imagine standing in the center of that Victorian ward, the lamps flickering over rows of beds, the air heavy with the weight of every story contained within these walls. You hear the faint rustle of blankets, the uneven breaths, the soft tremor of whispered fears, and in that moment a quiet understanding settles over you, the kind that does not shout, does not plead, but holds steady like a shadow just at the edge of sight. In this late hour, let these memories drift away slowly. Let the weight of the past settle into stillness. Let the voices that once trembled fade into the background as night folds gently around you. Close your eyes. Breathe softly. Let the echoes of history loosen their grip on your thoughts. Tonight nothing is asked of you. Nothing follows you. Nothing demands your vigilance. Just rest here in the quiet as the darkness softens and the world grows calm again. Good night.